Chapter 1. When Roddy struggled to open his eyes, the glaring sunlight made him dizzy. He felt a burning pain in his chest, as though a torch was pressed against his chest. His ears buzzed incessantly, as though he was hit in the head with a stick. The pain hit him, and he couldn't help but groan. The simulation effect of the online game Earthbreaker was close to 100%. Even the tactile sensation could be simulated. However, at this moment, Roddy felt as though someone had adjusted the pain option from 30% to 100%. He had played Earthbreaker for so long, but he had never felt so much pain before. After taking a few deep breaths, Roddy blinked his eyes and habitually looked around. He was surprised to find that he was not at the resurrection point of the military base that was 3 kilometers away from the battlefield. Something was wrong. He raised his hand and found that the epic short bow in his hand had disappeared. Even the gloves, bracers known as Hillsguard had disappeared completely. His waist was empty. His dual blades were not there. What happened? He broke out in cold sweat. The equipment in the holographic simulation game Earthbreaker was bound to the user's soul. Even if they were to be destroyed, they would need to be authenticated. Under such circumstances, where did all his valuable equipment go? Roddy rubbed his chest and gasped in pain. The fresh blood on his finger told him that he was injured. He tried his best to turn over. Roddy wanted to confirm where he had resurrected to, but then, he opened his mouth in shock. In front of him was an endless grassland. His vision was filled with green, and he was lying on top of a protruding slope. Roddy suddenly realized that this place was very similar to the Nehemiah Prairie. But then he thought about it. This place was thousands of miles away from the Slav Valley battlefield, where he had just died. How did he get here? Because he had just woken up, Roddy's brain seemed to be a little slow. But this doubt did not last long before he was interrupted by a loud shout. "Kill them!" A Sabine language unique to the orcs made Roddy's heart skip a beat. He instinctively lowered his body and looked to the other side while enduring the pain. The fragrance of grass was mixed with the smell of blood. Roddy rubbed his eyes and shifted his body. Only then did he see the scene at the bottom of the grassy slope. Not far from Roddy, there were several fallen war horses and 3 human corpses lying on the grass. The one who spoke just now was a tall orc less than 30 meters away from him. That fellow was almost 2 meters tall. His arms were as thick as a human's thigh, and his powerful muscles seemed to contain boundless strength. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was madly charging towards 7 human soldiers who were fleeing with 4 of his kind. To put it simply, Roddy was an otaku. But to go further, he was the kind of technical otaku who was often jokingly called saving the world. The highest mode of the God of War series was cleared without any damage. DJBO, Super Mario, 9 minutes with 1 life. Metal Gear Solid 2 did not use a rocket launcher, but used a pistol to blow up the plane boss. Such things were almost impossible for ordinary people, but for Roddy it was not difficult. If he decided to do it, he must do it to the best of his ability. This obsessive-compulsive personality was the main reason why Roddy could become a first-rate player in Earthbreaker. And now, after he confirmed his situation, all his thoughts had already begun to set out according to the premise of perfect completion of the instant's quest. Die and return to the city? For a technical otaku, that was an insult. Kill all the orcs and save as many scouts as possible. Based on his current identity and situation, Roddy quickly made his own judgment on the perfect completion goal of this instant's quest. Slowly exhaling, he turned over and lay down. He tore off a piece of cloth and simply bandaged the wound on his chest. Then, he looked around and began to think about the next step of his plan of action. He had no skill bar, his body was weak, his left knee and chest were in excruciating pain, probably due to the fall from the horse. He rubbed his forehead, feeling that something was not right, but the situation was urgent. The few doubts that had just risen in his mind were quickly thrown to the back of his mind due to the pressure brought by the orcs. Looking around, Roddy, who was a ranger in the game, quickly decided on the next step of his plan. After confirming that the orcs were not paying attention to him, he immediately held his breath and crawled towards the nearest human corpse. In the distance, not only were there 5 orcs chasing the deserters, there was also a slightly skinny guy holding a horned bow, sniping at the human soldiers who were being chased away by the orcs 30 meters away. Bang! When a horned bow was released, the movement of the bowstring was not small. Naturally, Roddy knew that the orcs would not have the habit of tying a silencer to the bowstring. This group of people's tactics were as ugly as their look. The only useful thing was perhaps their much stronger strength than humans. This orc had just shot an arrow through the chest of a scout in the distance. Blood spurted out, and the huge force of the arrow caused the scout's body to roll on the ground. The scout did not even have time to say a word before he died. Seeing this, Roddy, who hated the orcs to the core, immediately made his decision. He gritted his teeth and crawled to the side of the nearest human corpse. He stretched out his hand and tried his best to pull the wooden short bow that had fallen to the ground. Roddy had a rough idea of the item in his hand. It was the work of a border archer, mass-produced by a small workshop. It did not have much draw power and could only be used for sneak attack. If it was a positional battle, there was basically no need to think about the lethality of this toy-like whiteboard equipment. In the game, although attack power and weight were closely related, due to the additional attributes, the damage of a high-grade bow could be 10 times stronger than a low-grade bow with a 60-pound draw power. In Roddy's eyes, the lowest-grade wooden short bow in his hand was completely a beginner's outfit. However, the simple and crude weapon could not be used as an excuse for failing the mission. Who was Roddy? He was one of the strongest rangers in the Earthbreaker. As a technological geek, the things he could do were things that most people could only dream of. For example, the archery that was so powerful that it did not need the system to modify it. Hooking his leg over the quiver that was scattered on the side, Roddy did not carry it on his back. Instead, he reached out to grab the remaining 8 arrows in the quiver. Holding the bow in his left hand, he arched his back slightly and began to carefully observe all the enemies around him. The nearest orc with the bow was 27 meters away, and the distance between the 5 orcs ranged from 35 to 46 meters. 4 of the remaining humans were running for their lives. Soon, another unlucky person was caught by the orc and was chopped into meat paste. A light breeze blew past, blowing the hair in front of Roddy's forehead. He squinted his eyes and glanced at the slightly trembling grass on the ground. He had already adjusted the direction of the wind to the effect of the arrow. The orc with the horn bow 27 meters away did not notice the commotion behind him. It was trying its best to aim further away, concentrating on its target. Taking a deep breath, Roddy suddenly stood up. He pushed the bow forward with his left hand. His pinky and ring fingers caught 7 arrows at the same time. His right hand knocked an arrow and pulled the bowstring to a full arc. He aimed at the enemy smoothly. When a veteran scout was shooting, the series of steps of pulling arrow, knocking arrow, drawing bowstring, aiming and releasing would require at least 2 seconds of preparation time. However, for a technological geek like Roddy, his many years as a ranger had made this series of movements almost second nature to his body. From the moment he crawled to the moment he stood up, the whole shooting process was already complete. When the orc 27 meters away fired his arrow, Roddy had already completed the last step of the shooting process. Release. The bowstring made a bang sound and the arrow was released. Puff! The long arrow pierced through the back of the neck and out the front of the mouth. The orc did not even have the time to scream before he fell to the ground, clutching his throat. Cold weapons did not make any exaggerated noise like hot weapons. Therefore, the 5 orcs in the distance did not notice what happened behind them. However, What was even more unbelievable was that when the first orc was shot through the head and fell to the ground, Roddy had already released the next arrow. The interval was 1.2 seconds. The reason why Roddy held the bow and arrow with his left hand was to use a simple and practical, rapid shooting, archery skill. Ordinary people would reach their right hand to the quiver on their back to take out the arrow before they could nock the arrow. However, Roddy used this method to skip the step of taking out the arrow from his back. Therefore, his shooting speed was far beyond the limits of ordinary people. Puff! The arrow nailed into the thigh of an orc, causing him to roll on the ground and wail in pain. Roddy understood that he was using a short bow that he was not familiar with. He could not guarantee the accuracy of the arrow's curvature. Therefore, in order to ensure the efficiency of his shooting, Roddy, who had killed thousands of orcs in the game, naturally knew how to kill the enemy while paying the smallest price. Chapter 2. There were still 3 arrows left in Roddy's hand. The remaining orc seemed to have finally understood what had happened to him. He immediately gave up on chasing the 3 humans in front of him and charged straight at Roddy. The orc's body was huge, his face was ferocious, and his muscles were as thick as a beast's. Although he was still 40 meters away, with his strong explosive power, he could reach Roddy in less than 5 seconds. The 3 scouts who were being chased earlier noticed this and stared at Roddy with wide eyes, as if they could already see him being torn to pieces. There was nothing else. These scouts could not even think of a human defeating an orc in their minds. They were already scared out of their wits and had completely lost the will to fight back. One of them opened his mouth and wanted to shout the word "run," but because of his trembling, he could not say it clearly. But soon enough, the 3 scouts stopped running. In the distance, Roddy, who was waiting for the orc to charge at him, was focused on the front. He seemed to have forgotten the pain in his chest and knees. He was expressionless as he once again knocked his bow, pulled it, and released it. Pooh! The orc's right collarbone was hit by the arrow, causing his arm movements to become extremely stiff. His overall speed was reduced by 20%. Pooh! When the second arrow was shot, the orc was already 15 meters away from Roddy. The arrow's power was greatly increased due to the speed at which the orc was charging at him. It directly pierced through the orc's thigh. In the midst of the pain, the orc's body involuntarily lost its balance. He should not have been in such a sorry state, but because he could not move his arm freely, he fell completely. After hitting the ground with a thud, he continued to roll towards Roddy due to inertia. Roddy, who had not moved even half a step, did not even blink as he watched the huge body finally roll to a meter in front of him. Taking a step forward, raising his leg, Roddy stomped hard on the orc's neck. The sound of his Adam's apple and neck bones breaking was unusually clear. The orc's head appeared to be twisted at a strange angle. After his entire body twitched for a while, there was no more movement. Phew! Roddy heaved a sigh of relief. He cursed in his heart that his body had deteriorated to such an extent. Enduring the pain in his chest, he bent down and pulled out an unbroken arrow from the orc's body. Then, he walked towards the struggling orcs. After estimating the effects of the previous few arrows, even without any notification, Roddy had a rough idea of the relationship between his current attack power and the opponent's health. He gripped the short bow in his hand and slowly drew the bowstring. Not far away, an orc endured the pain and pulled out the arrow from his leg. He stood up with a limp, but before he could take 2 steps, an arrow pierced through his head. His brain matter suddenly sprayed all over the ground. There was no reason for Roddy to miss a 30-meter target. There were still 2 arrows left. Roddy muttered in his heart, his gaze fixed on the remaining orcs in the distance. He was extremely focused. This was the biggest reason why a technical geek could surpass ordinary people. When he entered this state, the only purpose of his brain's work was to complete the set goals that he had set. For example, the unscathed clearing process that could be uploaded on the internet, or the horrifying music game that could only be played by an octopus, or, in the shortest time possible, with the limited and simple weapons at hand, kill all the enemies. Under the blue sky and white clouds, this slightly absurd scene played out on the Nehemiah Plains. Roddy was taking slow and arduous steps towards the remaining 3 orcs, giving them an indescribable sense of oppression. One of the orcs stood up unsteadily. In the next moment, Roddy raised his hand and shot an arrow through his throat. Then, he pinched the last arrow and continued forward. The 2 remaining orcs were still in a daze from the beginning of the chase until now, when they were almost completely annihilated. At this moment, they realized that their teammate with the horn bow had fallen to the ground with an arrow in his body, and the rest of their comrades were all dead. Everything seemed to be because of this pale and weak human with a chest full of blood in front of them. "Roddy? You're still alive?" The remaining human soldiers in the distance finally accepted the fact that he had single-handedly killed all of the enemies. To them, this scene was simply unimaginable, because this fellow who had saved their lives was actually the weakest and most spineless of the entire scout team. In their impression, a coward who could not even hold a sword had actually killed all the orcs with a short bow? The surviving scouts were as confused as the orc. Only when one of them realized that Roddy only had 1 arrow left in his hand did they remember that they actually had the ability to kill the orc. "What are you waiting for? Go and kill those bastards." The vice-captain of the scout team was called Carter. At this moment, he also came to his senses and shouted. He did not think about how he had ostracized Roddy in the past and rushed towards the orcs in front of him. At this moment, Roddy had also shot the last arrow and killed one of the 2 remaining orcs. Boom! The heavy body fell to the ground. The last orc on the battlefield looked at Roddy, who was already 5 meters away from him, and was stunned. Looking at the bodies of his comrades that were gradually turning cold, he roared angrily and dragged his crippled leg to get up. He waved his wooden stick and staggered towards Roddy. In the distance, Vice-Captain Carter was rushing towards them. However, he realized that he could not help Roddy kill the last orc. Seeing the giant stick in the orc's hand falling down, he cursed in his heart. "Why is this bastard so stupid to actually run to the enemy? Idiot! You will be killed if you do that." However, he did not know that when the geek Roddy wanted to kill someone, all his actions were built on the basis of calm thinking and judgment. The giant stick fell as if it was going to smash Roddy into meat paste. However, the moment the orc raised his hand, Roddy took a step to the side. He did not roll to dodge, but moved his body half a meter away. In the next moment, the stick almost brushed past his body and smashed onto the ground. There was a dull thud, but the orc found that he didn't hit anything. This scene almost made Vice-Captain Carter, who was not far away, drop his jaw. "This can't." Before he could finish muttering, he saw Roddy's body move in a strange manner. He leisurely raised his leg and kicked the back of the orc's knee. The timing was perfect. Just as the orc lost his balance and knelt on the ground, he casually raised his hand and put the bowstring on the thick neck of the orc. In the next moment, Roddy's body was like a spring. Standing behind the orc, he suddenly pulled the bowstring. The bowstring was strangled to the orc's throat, and the orc wanted to pull it away. However, Roddy raised his feet and stepped on the orc's back. He used all his strength to pull back, and when the bowstring was at an acute angle, he suddenly twisted the bow in his hand. The orc's eyes suddenly widened. He frantically tried to pull the bowstring that was strangling his neck, but found that no matter how much strength he used, it was useless. Roddy just silently pulled back without moving, letting the orc's hands struggle helplessly. However, he did not have any other expression. In just a minute, the orc gave up resisting and finally died from suffocation. His eyes protruded out, and the originally green skin on his face turned dark purple. He died in an extremely tragic manner. The 3 scouts who escaped previously had already arrived behind Roddy. However, when they saw the scene of corpses, they collectively fell silent. None of them actually dared to step forward and greet Roddy. The atmosphere suddenly became a little strange. The smell of blood permeated the surroundings, and there seemed to be only the occasional sound of the wind blowing over the quiet grassland. Because of the battle just now and the pain on his body, Roddy was panting heavily. However, he was obviously not interested in his NPC teammates. As a player, Roddy's mind was only thinking about cleaning up the mess after completing the mission. That was why he, who always thought that he was clearing a dungeon, panted heavily as he stood up. He hobbled to the side and began to rummage through the orc corpses. He pulled out the arrows and hummed to himself. On the other side of the mountain, on the other side of the sea, there is a group of Smurfs. They are lively and smart. They are mischievous and agile. Roddy casually sang a song that these guys did not understand. Little did he know that Carter and the others behind him had their eyes wide open, as if they had completely lost the ability to speak. There were quite a number of corpses on the ground. Roddy swept his gaze across the entire battlefield as he pulled out the items. As a ranger, he could deduce the cause of the battle based on the traces on the scene. An orc patrol encountered a small team of human scouts on the plains. The scouts were riding horses, so they arrogantly thought that they could fight against these green-skinned beasts. However, they did not expect to be ambushed by the orcs when they approached, and almost all of their warhorses were overturned. Not far away, there were warhorses with broken legs and scouts with broken necks that explained everything. Obviously, what happened next was a one-sided massacre. After 2 orcs were killed, they began to chase the scouts away. It was only when Roddy woke up and unleashed his power that they turned the tables. Why is it all trash? Roddy frowned as he looked at the spoils of war in his hands. Other than a few broken copper coins, the only thing that these orcs contributed that could be used was the horn bow. Other than a few wooden sticks, this group of poor people did not even have any decent iron product. Roddy felt that something was wrong. If he had entered a strange dungeon, then he would not have been rewarded with such trash. Moreover, until now, he did not see any mission completion notification in front of him. Raising his head to look at the remaining few scouts, he did not see the notification symbol on top of the NPC's head as he expected. Moreover, wasn't the blood that they spat out during the battle a little too realistic? It was a little different from how it usually was in the game. The wound on his chest was very painful, but it seemed to be due to the adrenaline. At this time, it was not as exaggerated as before. Roddy instinctively searched for a long time, but did not find anything like a health potion. Instead, he rummaged through his own pocket and found a roll of linen bandages. "It's better than nothing," he muttered. He tore off the cloth that he had hastily tied up earlier, gritted his teeth, and wrapped the linen bandages around his chest. He still did not pay attention to the few stunned scouts. It was not until 3 minutes later that Roddy finished bandaging his wound and heaved a sigh of relief. When he turned his head, he realized that the 3 people in front of him were looking at him as if they were looking at a monster. Everything had to be based on the interactions of the NPCs before making a decision. Hearing Roddy's fluent Buellingen, Deputy Captain Carter quickly signaled the scout behind him to clean up the corpses. However, in his heart, he was bewildered. How did Roddy's strength suddenly become so terrifying? That series of actions just now did not seem like something a recruit could do. Could a short bow be used to strangle the throat? Even the veterans who had participated in the border war many years ago would not be able to kill someone in such an unimaginable way. Looking at the fallen orcs around them, they were either shot in the throat, the eye, or the mouth. Which soldier would not know what it meant to have such a high level of archery? There were quite a few scouts who could hit a fixed target from 20 meters away, but on the battlefield, if they could hit even a third of their usual accuracy, it would be enough for them to become Lord Kirk's elite soldiers. What they had just faced was a group of strong orcs that could run and move, not some straw target with a red heart in the middle. How could he hit so accurately? Of course, what Carter did not know was that the young man before him, whom he called Roddy, was actually a level 115 ranger player. In the Earthbreaker, the player's level was stacked, in other words, basic profession level plus advanced profession level. Roddy had 2 advanced profession levels, which were level 59 Ranger and level 31 Berserker. His basic profession was Army Soldier, which was level 25. The maximum level of a basic class was 25, so his Army Soldier was at the maximum level. As for the advanced class, there was no upper limit. However, in the advanced class, level 30 and level 60 were the 2 major thresholds. This was because these 2 thresholds could not be leveled up with sufficient EXP. Instead, one needed to go through a series of difficult and dangerous trial missions. Level 60 was extremely difficult, and almost 99% of the players were unable to level up. However, once they crossed this threshold, the strength of the players would increase exponentially. From this, it could be seen that Roddy's strength was level 59 and level 31. This meant that among all the players in the Earthbreaker, Roddy was already in the first echelon of professional players. But now Roddy realized that his equipment, skills, and even titles had all disappeared. He had completely turned into a newbie, and he was probably the lowest of all. When he looked at his uniform that had turned white from washing, he understood that this was definitely not the result of being thrifty. The military logistics officers were greedy, so they would naturally pick on Coward. Unfortunately, he seemed to be the most cowardly of them all. Carter, who was standing in front of Roddy, swallowed his saliva and did not know what to say. Of course, he had noticed the changes in Roddy. What did Roddy look like before? He was really just a little brat who was ordered around by others. But now? Although Carter was only the vice-captain of the village's scouts, he had dealt with the powerful knights in the territory, so he thought that he had seen a lot of things. So at this moment, he faintly felt that it was best not to offend this guy who suddenly had a sudden increase in strength. After thinking this through, Carter's heart was filled with some thoughts. Seeing that Roddy was about to bury his comrade with the other 2, he immediately said, "Roddy, if it wasn't for you, we would have gone to see Goddess Chi. I think your injuries are more serious, you should take a rest first." His words were extremely polite, but in his heart, he knew that he was actually ordering Roddy around by calling him a little brat and a little bastard a day ago. Roddy? Of course, Roddy's hearing was not bad. He frowned. He did not think that it was a coincidence that the vice-captain called his name wrong twice. If there was a correct judgment, then his current identity was not the player Roddy, but a newbie named Roddy. What kind of dungeon is this? Although Roddy had more and more doubts in his heart, he still replied politely, "My injuries are not a problem, Sir Captain. What is our next mission?" Mission? Carter was stunned. He thought to himself, "Do you still need to ask? Of course it's to leave this damn place as soon as possible." However, when the words were on the tip of his tongue, he changed them to, "We will cut off the heads of the orcs and bring them back to Norland Village. I hope that Second Lieutenant Sodden will understand that the enemy has paid a heavy price. I think your contribution will definitely be rewarded by the Second Lieutenant." Although Carter was jealous, he still understood that Roddy deserved some merit medals. After all, he could not kill so many strong orcs by himself. However, Roddy's next words made his eyes widen. "Sir Captain, I am just an ordinary private. In this battle, you personally killed 6 orcs, and I was only slightly injured in order to protect you, Captain. Isn't that right?" Roddy had dealt with NPCs like this countless times. In this situation, if he foolishly asked for credit, he would only end up offending them. On the contrary, although his righteous words had given away the credit, in reality, the system would still give him his share of the reward. Do not offend NPCs, especially friendly NPCs. This was one of the most important lessons he had learned after playing the game for 7 years. Although Vice Captain Carter was a little afraid of Roddy's strength, after some thought, he still put on an expression that said, "You are very smart." After some hesitation, he tacitly accepted Roddy's responsibility. He spoke more politely and attentively took out his wineskin and threw it to Roddy. The latter gratefully took a gulp, but his face instantly turned red. After coughing for a long time, he handed the wineskin back. This scene made Carter laugh. He patted Roddy's shoulder. The two of them seemed to have become much closer. The rest of the scouts moved the horses over, and the remaining 4 survivors took the belongings of their comrade, mounted the horses, and began to return the way they came. Back to where? Roddy, who was complaining about the taste of the wine, felt a little dizzy. It was not that he had never drunk wine in the game before, but he had never heard of anyone getting drunk after drinking it. Although the earth splitter was connected to the nerves, it could not simulate the effects of alcohol. Roddy knew this very well. But who cares? I'll just follow the NPC. Roddy felt dizzy as he judged the scenery around him. He realized that his field of vision was still empty. The various plugins and default skill bars had all disappeared. The minimap function was also gone. Then, he realized that he could not remember where he was in the Nehemiah plane. The otaku Roddy had a bad premonition. He felt that riding a horse was a little strange. I don't think riding a horse in the game is this bumpy. Why does it feel so real? Could it be that the game has updated with a patch pack? The scouts in the team were unusually quiet due to the death of their comrade. Other than Carter, the remaining 2 were young. They looked to be around 20 years old. One look and anyone could tell that they were not very skilled. Although they had weapons, their aura was too weak. They were the kind of weaklings who could not fight on the battlefield. As a veteran player, Roddy, of course, had the right to make such a judgment. But while he was secretly observing these guys, he found something not so good. The military uniform of these soldiers was obviously the old-fashioned military uniform of the Kingdom of Karen. He did not notice it during the previous battle, but now he could see the emblem on his shoulder and the other soldier's shoulder clearly. It was the head of a warg, a wolf's head with a side profile. Why is this emblem here? The head of the warg was the emblem of the Lucifron family of the Kingdom of Karen. This family had been on the decline since the beginning of the game. Players who were born in the Human Empire would receive many quests related to this family when they were in the beginner's village. It could be said that the name Lucifron was very familiar to players. However, as the game progressed, the internal and external conflicts of the kingdom broke out. The Lucifron family became the representative of a party of treason and completely disappeared in the chaos of war. Then, who are these people? Remnants of a gang of thieves? But what am I? Chapter 4. Vice Captain Carter led the team back to the village on the vast Nehemiah plain. They finally arrived at their resting place. The scene in front of them made Roddy, who was still dizzy from the alcohol, shudder. Norland Village. Roddy stared at the wooden sign at the entrance of the village. He sat on his horse in a daze, forgetting to dismount for a moment. Roddy. Vice Captain Carter led his horse to the stable and turned his head around to ask. The latter gulped with difficulty. He dismounted his horse stiffly and followed Carter with a limp. Like all the villages on the border of the Kingdom of Karen, Norland Village was not large. There were only 3 or 4 dirty streets in total. As a typical feudal dynasty's territory, Norland Village had a manor, which belonged to Lord Kirk. Around the manor there were farmhouses and field. The population was less than 200. There was a blacksmith shop and a simple square. The largest building was the windmill by the river. The farmers had returned to the village. The huge fan was no longer spinning under the setting sun. The atmosphere here was peaceful. Dogs barked and chickens crowed occasionally. The farmers who had finished their farm work were talking about various topics. Everything looked like a normal village. Norland Village was not surrounded by walls or any protective facilities. There were no station troops either. However, because of its special location on the border, the highest lord, Duke Lucifron, made an exception and set up 2 scouts here. The original lord of the manor, Kirk, came here only once a year. Therefore, the leader of the village was the butler sent by the lord to watch over the manor. However, because the scouts belonged to Duke's army, the butler had no authority over Roddy's team. It was already late. Vice Captain Carter dismissed the team. He carried a sack of orc heads and walked to the room of the commander of the 2 teams, Second Lieutenant Sodden. Roddy, on the other hand, followed a few of his comrades to the tent at the village entrance, where the soldiers ate together. His steps were a little unsteady. It was unclear whether it was because of the wound or the strong liquor. Roddy rubbed his eyes several times, but he still felt like he was in a dream, because he gradually realized an important problem that he had neglected before. Everything that his body was feeling seemed a little too real. The villagers in his field of vision were dressed in simple clothes. There were herdsmen driving their flocks of sheep on the dirt road that traversed through the village. Children playing in the mud on the ground playfully ran past. Jingle bells were clanging in the blacksmith's shop. Smoke was rising from the chimneys of the farmhouses in the setting sun. Everything made him feel that the game did not have such realistic details. Roddy walked all the way into the simple and crude canteen. He sat on a wooden bench and listened to his comrades, who were supposed to be NPCs, talking about the battle that happened today. He looked at everything in front of him with a complicated gaze, and his heart was filled with uncontrollable panic. What exactly is going on? There were many questions in his heart. What he wanted to know the most was, why did he seem to have entered a place that seemed to exist in reality? Where's the game server? Where's the menu? What about the option to quit the game? For a modern person who was still wondering if he should eat at McDonald's tonight, it was unrealistic for his mind to not be in a mess when he suddenly entered such a world. Quit the game. He tried the voice commands of Earthbreaker in a low voice. As a holographic simulation online game, Roddy would rather believe that this was a bug in the game. However, as the command to quit the game failed, his heart sank bit by bit. This won't work. Not even forcefully logging off? Are you kidding me? The scouts who were eating at the side looked at Roddy, muttering in a language that they could not understand. Their gazes were a little strange, but Roddy obviously had no time to care about them. He still lowered his head and muttered something like a mage chanting an incantation. None of the commands worked. Roddy pursed his lips and thought for a long time. In the end, he decided to make one last attempt. He no longer spoke in Mandarin, but in Bulinga. Character Attributes Panel. F***CK. The scout who was drinking his soup spat out the soup on the table because of his exclamation. Roddy hurriedly apologized to the scout and sat back down. His eyes were filled with excitement and amazement as he looked forward. He looked at the clear attribute panel and immediately determined that Earthbreaker had a reload bug. He was filled with joy as he prepared to call out the quit game option. However, the anticipation on his face froze in the next instant. Still nothing? A chill gradually spread from the bottom of his heart. Roddy immediately tried all sorts of methods. He listed almost all the menus that he could summon, including the mission panel, the equipment panel, the character attribute panel, and so on. However, he could not find the main menu to quit the game. The uncertain thought in his heart surfaced once again. Could it be that he was not in the game world but in the real world? After taking a few deep breaths, Roddy suddenly thought of a way to confirm whether he was in the game or not. Although all the food in Earthbreaker could be eaten, it would never stimulate the taste bud. Just like how drinking alcohol would never cause one to get drunk, food would never have any taste. This was because the holographic simulation technology could not meet this requirement and the game company had never done any research in this area. He lowered his head and looked at the black, unfermented bread in front of him. He swallowed hard and broke off a piece of it. Looking at the crumbs of the bread on the table, Roddy's heart sank to the bottom. The game did not have such a realistic physical effect. However, he still stuffed the bread into his mouth and chewed slowly. Sour, bitter, and dry. The taste of the black bread was 10,000 times worse than the toast that Roddy bought in the supermarket. However, the terrible taste of the bread was insignificant compared to the fact that it had proven, at that moment, he finally realized that he might not be able to return to his original life. This was the real world. He had actually transmigrated to the same real world as Earthbreaker? He forced himself to chew the bread nervously. Roddy was stunned for a few minutes before he tried to adapt to the reality in front of him. It was rare for a technological geek to be emotional. Roddy was not like a woman who was at a loss for a few days. He thought for a while and decided to look at his attributes again. Then, he sighed heavily. His interface, which was filled with titles and various values, was now as empty as a street that had been swept clean. All that was left was the name of the basic profession, Army Soldier, and the level 1 behind it looked like the goddess of fate was giving him a middle finger, causing his lips to tremble for no reason. Below was a row of attributes: Strength, 13 plus 3 Agility, 8 plus 1 Spirit, 6 plus 1 Vitality, 9 plus 3 Intelligence, 5 plus 1. The attributes in brackets were the growth points brought by the basic profession of Army Soldier. The Army Soldier was also the first choice for human physical professions. Hence, Roddy was no stranger to this profession. In the game, attributes could not be assigned by oneself. Every time one leveled up, it would automatically increase or decrease according to the characteristics of the profession. Hence, he did not care about this. As long as he leveled up, everything would be fine. Just as these thoughts appeared in his mind, he could not help but feel a little amused. He could actually level up in the real world? Thinking of this, he could not help but look at the experience bar. Instantly, his expression became very interesting. The 159 experience points that he had gained from killing the orcs were clearly displayed there. Roddy laughed helplessly. He temporarily accepted this ridiculous world. Then, he began to think about his battle today. Thinking about it, he had actually gained quite a lot of experience points. After all, the current Norland village was probably no different from the novice village, Norland village in the future. At that time, who would dare to cause trouble for the orcs when they were only level 1? At most, they would kill some wolves in the wild, run errands between the villages to deliver a message, and catch a few rabbits. Yesterday, he had encountered the orc scouting team, but they were all level 2 to 4. For beginner players, this kind of enemy was a headache. Because they were in groups, and occasionally had the help of mount wolves, meeting them usually boded ill rather than well. Roddy looked at it. To level up to the second level required 300 experience points. At the moment, he was still short of 141 experience points. Speaking of which, he was already more than halfway there. He then called out the character's equipment bar. Head, neck, shoulders, chest, arms, wrist guards, belt, legs, feet, special accessories, rings, left and right hand weapons. A total of 14 equipment bars appeared in front of him at a glance. Of course, they were basically empty. Including the 2 ring bars, there were a total of 14 slots. This was enough to show the importance of equipment to players. In the later stages of the game, there would often be situations where the attributes of a set of equipment were more than 10 times the attributes of the character itself. And the professional players in the game were all powerful players who had a full set of exquisite equipment. Roddy believed that his skills were not inferior to anyone. If he had not switched to PvP later than others, he would have already been at the top of the first echelon. But now, looking at the equipment bar, he could not help but sigh. A set of broken white equipment with no attributes to speak of, and a short sword that could not be any weaker made him no different from an NPC. Only the accessory on his neck indicated that it was equipped. Roddy did not take a closer look at it. He only thought that it was some ordinary necklace because there was no equipment attached to it. Thinking of the orc horn bow that he had collected yesterday, Roddy's mood improved a little. He called out the attribute bar and looked at his HP. His heart was strangely tight, but he shook his head. He knew that there were no health potions or herbs to speed up his HP recovery in this kind of place. Turning off the options, Roddy turned his eyes back to the front. He could not help but think about his current situation. This is Norland Village. Norland Village, his brows furrowed even tighter. He recalled his memories of the game. Wasn't Norland Village completely destroyed by the orcs? Before Roddy traveled to this place, it had already become a supply station for the orcs. How could there be humans there? It was not just Norland Village. In Roddy's life in the game Earthbreaker, the orcs who had infiltrated from the northwest had almost conquered the entire western part of the kingdom of Karen. This had something to do with the incompetence and spineless royal family of the Lucifron family. As the headquarters of the Lucifron family, Hollier City had long become the bridgehead for the orcs to invade the kingdom of Karen. The unknown environment made Roddy more and more irritated. He tried to calm his rapid breathing, got up and walked to the basin beside the shed to wash his face. But when he reached out his hand and touched the water, he was completely stunned. The reflection of the water reflected a strange face. Roddy swore that he would never forget what he looked like. But at this moment, he really understood what was wrong. He seemed to have become another person. He came to this strange game world, and he happened to be at a strange time. Not far away, a few scouts who used to be disdainful of Roddy were now in awe of him after today's events. They saw him staring at the basin in a daze. They did not even dare to mock him. However, the scouts gradually noticed the strange atmosphere. Because Roddy had been staring at the basin for 5 minutes. Roddy! Roddy, who was awakened, suddenly raised his head. His confused eyes gradually found focus again. He looked at the scout who asked the question and asked without any rhyme or reason, "What day is today?" This sentence pattern was very strange. The scout who was about to answer the question was stunned. He wanted to ask if the scout was stupid, but when he thought of Roddy's behavior today, he answered cautiously, "April 10th. What year is it?" Roddy's question made the other soldiers in the hut turn around. The atmosphere was depressing because of the death of a few scouts. However, Roddy's question made some of them feel funny. The captain of the scouts, Ruger, scolded, "Did you fall off your horse and become stupid today, you little bastard? Don't you know which year it is?" His disdainful tone showed that he did not take Roddy seriously at all. The surviving scouts of the 2nd Squadron, however, had a much better attitude. They gulped and answered honestly, "This year is Iron's year 588. Chapter 5. All right, thank you. Roddy's throat was a little dry, as if he did not know what to do. He looked around for a long time and asked in a low voice, Where is the resting area?" The scout seemed to have gotten used to his weird questions and pointed to a house not far away. Roddy turned around and left as if he had just been pardoned. The leftover food was placed on the simple wooden table and gradually turned cold. "What's wrong with this little bastard?" The captain of the 1st Squad named Ruger curled his lip. He usually scolded the youngsters in front of him. Although he felt that Roddy was a little strange, he was too lazy to think about it. He turned around and saw Roddy's leftover bread on the table. He reached out and snatched it while muttering something along the lines of, "This little bastard only knows how to waste food. He'll starve to death sooner or later." Roddy, who had walked back to his dormitory, could not be bothered to think about what those guys were saying. His mind was already filled with information. I actually went back to 9 years ago? Iron calendar year 588. That was the year before the game Earthbreaker was released. Roddy's experience as a player was from the autumn of year 590 to the winter of year 597. During that period of time there were countless battles on the continent. The war was frequent and the heroes were at odds with each other. The players experienced what it meant to be epic and magnificent. That was also the main reason why Earthbreaker was so popular for so long. However, when Roddy overlapped the game world that he had experienced with the reality before him, he still felt that it was an extremely unreal and awkward illusion. Damn it! Roddy suddenly cursed out loud and reached for his pocket. However, he found that he was not wearing a t-shirt and shorts. He also did not have a cigarette or lighter in his pocket. He could not help but sigh. What the hell is going on? From the moment he woke up to the inexplicable battle to the moment he realized that he was not in the game, Roddy broke out in a cold sweat. His habitual thinking had almost killed him. If he had known what was going on, he would not have been as calm as he was today if he had used his bow and 8 arrows to kill the orcs. After all, there was no such thing as resurrection in the graveyard in the real world. Roddy rubbed his head and sat on the hard bed in the low house. Today's events were too unimaginable. It was difficult for him to remain calm. However, as a technological geek, his mind was much more realistic than others. If there was a problem, he had to think of a solution. Sighing or daydreaming would not do him any good. So, Roddy immediately started thinking about his current situation. The world they were currently in was definitely not a peaceful and prosperous world. From the name of the game, Earthbreaker, it could be seen that since the start of the game, territorial wars and power struggles had never stopped. Whenever a war stopped, the bastard manufacturer would release a new expansion pack, allowing the players to thoroughly experience the thrill of the age of turmoil amidst the flames of war. It was fine to play these things as a game, but to let the players experience it personally, Roddy did not think it was a good thing. When he thought about the fact that the game's timeline had not been opened yet, Roddy suddenly realized what he had. Countless images flashed through his mind. The kingdom of Karen that was invaded by the orcs and the undead, the defeat of the Legion after it was betrayed by the nobles, the incompetence of the royal family, and the arrogance of the Grand Duke after he gathered his army. None of these had happened yet. But then, Roddy could not help but think of a delicate face that he could never forget. The words of the young wizard who sacrificed herself for her hometown still seemed to be echoing in his ears. As a wizard, I can choose to continue pursuing the truth and the law, but I choose to stay with you. You should feel honored, Roddy. You said you can resurrect? That must be a joke of the Creator. Since you can stay here to protect them, why can't I? Roddy, I won't allow you to say that. You can't threaten me with our friendship. If you threaten me with friendship, I won't leave. I'm a wizard. Of course, I know my own condition. But before everything is over, can you kiss me? The memory came to an abrupt end. Everything stopped at the dark red of blood in his vision. Roddy almost bit his lips. He suddenly realized that he was very stupid, but also very smart. Why did he say that? After Roddy graduated from a third-rate university, splitting Earth became his only source of income. It was not shameful to say that he could earn money by playing games, but the mainstream society did not approve of it, especially when it came to dating. This was often the reason for a breakup. And so, Roddy's girlfriend of 3 years left him just like that. From then on, Roddy was severely injured. As a technological geek, he could only vent all his energy on the game. That was until he met a different NPC. He had a short but unforgettable friendship with the NPC. At that time, when many players mentioned Roddy, they would often say, "You mean that leather crafting master? That guy's bow is pretty good too." Or, yes, that pervert who can shoot arrows and speak Bringen fluently. And then there would be that otaku who treats an NPC as his girlfriend? Ha 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 ha, destined to be alone for life. There was a time when Roddy was very grateful to the artificial intelligence of Splitting Earth. This was because the game used a computer simulation character to calm the violence and hatred in his heart, so that the otaku of a generation did not take revenge on society because of emotional problems. But with the release of the new expansion pack, when the orcs tore apart the kingdom of Karen, and the beautiful figure fell in the flames of war, everything changed. Remorse, anger, Roddy's personality became more extreme than before. It was also because of this change that he changed from a life player, who relied on leather crafting and bowcrafting, to a PvP player, and in a short span of 2 years, he became one of the frontline players in the entire server. But what was gone was gone. He once regretted not switching to PvP earlier. That way, he might have been able to stop the orcs' invasion and prevent all the tragedies from happening. But now, when he saw the Norland village in front of him, Roddy had to thank this son of AB*TCH for his fate. He knew that he had a chance to start over. Roddy stood up abruptly, wanting to roar, but he slammed into a low wooden beam with a thud. He immediately sat back down, clutching his head while cursing. His wretched appearance stunned a few of his comrades who happened to enter the dormitory. When they saw Roddy speaking in a language that they did not understand, one of them said, "Roddy, no matter what, we have to say thank you for the way we treated you in the past. We hope you don't mind. It's fine, it's fine." Roddy grimaced in pain. He didn't take the other's words to heart. Instead, he added 2 sentences that puzzled them. "By the way, call me Roddy, not Roddy. I don't like that old name." Early mornings in Norland Village were always filled with the faint scent of milk. It was April, and the morning on the grassland was still a bit chilly. Some herdsmen in the village had milked their goat. Although the milk was a bit rancid, it was a precious thing that could be exchanged for a source of livelihood for the poor people. Inside Lord Kirk's manor, the servants were busy as usual, cleaning the pigeon houses and stables under the steward's direction. The farmers began plowing the fields, and the coachman began to transport some of the harvest from the manor to other territories. The sound of the carriage crunching as it traveled along the rough dirt road could be heard from far away. In the morning mist, the commoners and farmers who had just woken up were also busy. However, it was obvious that they had a lot more topics to talk about today. The topic was obviously the encounter between the scouts and the orcs yesterday. The encounter between the scouts and the orcs was a shocking event for the villagers of Norland Village. The orc heads that Carter brought back were neatly lined up on the wooden stakes in front of the village square. The smell of blood could be smelled from afar. As soon as the sun rose, a lot of mosquitoes and flies could be seen crawling on the corpses. Many villagers who wanted to see what was going on had an ugly look on their faces. Some children were even scared to the point of crying. Second Lieutenant Sodden, who was in charge of the scouts, had already ridden towards Hollier City after receiving Carter's report. At the same time, he ordered the scouts to increase the scope of their investigation in the next few days and avoid any more conflicts with the orcs. Although Second Lieutenant Sodden was a gluttonous and lazy person, he at least understood Carter's capabilities. Killing 6 orcs? The details of the battle, that Carter said could not stand up to scrutiny, were indeed full of loopholes. However, it did not matter as long as the orc heads were not fake. Sodden returned to Hollier City to report the news to Lord Duke. He believed that with so many orc heads, he would be able to earn enough merit points to leave this *T scout organization. As for the reward for Carter and the group of scouts, Sodden secretly sighed. Who cares about them? It was normal for a boss to not care about his subordinate. In a society similar to Europe in the Middle Ages, there was usually less pity. Apart from the nobles and lords, the people at the bottom of the hierarchy usually did not even have enough to eat. They might not even be able to keep their lives in case of natural disasters or ice disasters, let alone others. For the surviving scouts of Norland Village, their dead comrades could no longer be brought back to life. The hard days still had to continue. The only thing they could be thankful for was that their pay was slightly higher than that of the farmers who farmed all day long. As for other things, the young people who did not go to school and had long accepted this concept of life did not even think about it. The scouts did not talk about what happened yesterday. Roddy was very sensible and gave away the credit. Naturally, the remaining scouts would not be stupid enough to talk about the truth behind his back. As a result, when they woke up in the morning, the soldiers who did not know the truth were talking about how Captain Carter had heroically killed the orcs. On the other hand, Rhodey, who had killed the orcs, had disappeared without a trace. To be honest, no one who was reincarnated into a game would be able to calm down and fall asleep the moment they closed their eyes. Rhodey thought that he would experience a restless and excited night. Who would have thought that he would inexplicably fall asleep? When he woke up, there was some inexplicable information in his head. It seemed that he had completely forgotten these things when he woke up yesterday. They were the memories of the original owner of this body, Roddy. His father died in the army in a small-scale battle at the border 10 years ago. His mother passed away at an early age. Roddy could be considered as the most typical war orphan in this war-torn era. When he was young, he learned how to fight with a dagger from his father. However, he had never touched a single-handed sword. He was born in Norland Village and came from an ordinary family with a few acres of land. Occasionally, he would leave some money behind. However, after a few years of disasters, his family's financial situation declined. 3 years ago, after his mother passed away, he used his father's reputation to join this team. He was timid and cowardly. He even stuttered when talking to girls. Logically speaking, Roddy, who inherited his father's sturdy body, should have been a good soldier. However, he had a good body and good looks, but he did not have the slightest bit of manliness. He was always bullied by others, to the point where he gave up on himself. Roddy sighed at the memories in his mind. In comparison, his own personality was really the polar opposite of Roddy's. As a professional gamer who was highly respected on the internet and was highly confident in the gaming field, although Roddy was not a good young man, he had a normal moral outlook. However, he had a very obvious shortcoming. To put it bluntly, he was vengeful for the smallest grievance. This personality was not obvious at first, but ever since that incident, Roddy gradually turned from a harmless guy to a cold-blooded animal with an extreme and cold personality. He could not be called an ambitious person, because before he transmigrated, Roddy was only a slightly famous Lone Ranger in the game. He was not a guild leader or a big shot. However, if he was given a sufficient platform, it might not be difficult for Roddy to become an ambitious and ruthless person, since the two words that carried great weight. Chapter 6. After all, Roddy was not a nice guy before he transmigrated to this world. The things that he had done in the past had caused people to feel a chill in their hearts. He had successfully assassinated the guild leader of the enemy camp, infiltrated the enemy's rear and slaughtered a large number of mid-level officers of the orc. He had even completely destroyed a guild that tried to kill him because of a disagreement. He could do all of these things and he could also do it thoroughly. But now, Roddy, who was squatting at the entrance of Norland Village, had finally made up his mind. He had to admit that humans had strong adaptability. After understanding the situation, he quickly adapted to his current role and made plans for what he was going to do next. Of course, the so-called plan could be summed up in the following 4 sentences in his heart. 1. Find the little wizard who died in Mogra village, and never let her leave again. 2. Let those sons of B*cheese die. 3. Let those undead sons of bitches scram. 4. Let's make those traitorous lords eat **T. But Roddy thought for a while and felt that it was better to have a full meal first. The treatment of the scouts was better than those poor farmers. In Norland Village, where most people didn't eat breakfast, the scouts were one of the few who had food in the morning. Although it was only some coarse grains, it was better than nothing. Roddy, who was used to eating takeout or fast food, endured the hard and dark bread and tasteless ale. He was thinking about how to start his great revenge. Before he finished eating, he heard someone calling him. "Lo, Roddy, Captain Carter has just given us a new mission. The team will set off in 2 hours. This time, the patrol area will be larger. Captain asked me to inform you just now." "Got it. Those orcs won't let the matter rest after finding out that the corpses don't have heads. We might encounter them today, so be prepared." Roddy wanted to just nod and leave it at that, but he remembered that this wasn't a game. He immediately reminded the guys who were going to the battlefield later to be careful. He understood that he was now a Legion soldier. So if he wanted to level up, he could only continue to follow the path of a scout. Betray? Once the Lord revoked his identity, he was afraid that even his basic profession would disappear, and that would not be fun. After a simple breakfast, the scout team had to be reorganized into 2 teams due to the deaths of several members the day before. This meant that the 3 scouts that originally belonged to Team 1 would temporarily join Roddy's Team 2 and follow him on missions. Vice Captain Carter's attitude towards Roddy had taken a 180-degree turn. He didn't even try to hide the fact that he was taking care of Roddy. Seeing that the badge on his chest had changed from vice captain to captain, Roddy didn't regret the decision he had made yesterday. After reorganizing the team, he approached Carter and asked politely, "Captain, can I take a look at that bow? You know, if we encounter beastmen again, that bow might be more useful." In Roddy's memory, Carter was the typical portrayal of a soldier in this era, gossiping about village women, sighing about the harvest of the fields, flirting with the tailor's daughter, and telling dirty jokes to others. His ability was mediocre, he had no ambition, and his personality was considered pure. He just muddled along. So when the position of captain suddenly fell on his head, Carter was actually nervous and didn't have much of an opinion. After hearing Roddy's request and recalling the hole in the beastman's head yesterday, Carter's prestige immediately disappeared. He immediately replied, "Take it. You can ask Dick for as many arrows as you need. Tell him that I approved it." After saying that, he hesitated for a while and quietly took out a few copper coins. He looked around and said in a low voice, "This is a little repayment from me. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have been able to see the sun today." This was his pure and kind side. Carter, who was born as a villager, could only take out these copper coins. When he saw that Roddy was hesitating, he simply stuffed the copper coins into his hand. There was only gratitude and sincerity between his brows. In the end, Roddy did not refuse. In Roddy's memory, Carter, who was always boastful, had never shown this side of him. There were not many copper coins in his hand, but for a scout's salary, it was not a small amount. Perhaps this battle had really changed him. They are all simple people. Roddy could not help but sigh. After bowing and leaving, he did not think about these interpersonal relationships anymore. After all, the most important thing now was to have enough strength to deal with whatever might happen next. Looking at the beastman's crude horn bow, Roddy secretly sighed. This group of green-skinned barbarians was really wasteful. It was a good material, but it was ruined like this. He looked up and squinted his eyes as he recalled his experience of leveling here. After thinking for a while, he walked to the blacksmith shop on the east side of the village. In the game, Roddy had been relying on his side professions to support himself for a long period of time. His bow crafting and leather crafting were at the top of the Grand Master level. So right now, when he looked at the beastman's horn bow in his hand, he knew how to maximize the accuracy of the bow. If there was a need, Roddy found that he could skillfully craft leather and bow. Moreover, the quality of the things he made would definitely be superior. This might be one of the few good news since his rebirth. His brain was trying hard to adapt to this incomparably real world. His footsteps did not stop as he walked to the blacksmith shop of Ding Jingle. The blacksmith of Norland Village, Stan, knew Roddy. When he heard that Roddy wanted to borrow some tools, he was very straightforward. Not long after, Roddy unloaded the bowstring and began to trim the bow. He adjusted the arrow nests on the bowstring and filed a smaller bow window. After about an hour, he finished all of this. Then, he took the large horn bow and went to Dick in the military supply department to ask for some arrows. Norland Village was very small. The feudal lord could not stay here for more than 3 days a year. However, as one of the villages at the border of the kingdom, no matter how peaceful it was, it would eventually face the threat of the orcs. Roddy's gaze swept across the horizon. On the other side of the endless grassland was the kingdom of the orcs. In his memory, the orcs had been harassing the borders of the kingdom of Karen ever since the start of the game. Based on the timeline, Roddy believed that the orcs would not go anywhere obediently. Perhaps they would plunder the orcs during the bad years. How could a level 1 character like him stop the orcs? The target was too big, but it was not an impossible task for Roddy. He stopped in front of a slightly dilapidated warehouse at the side of the village. 50 arrows. I've already told Captain Carter. Roddy had a humble look on his face. It was necessary to build a good relationship with the quartermaster. Although he had used Carter's name, according to Roddy's memory, Carter and the quartermaster did not really see eye to eye. So, there were 3 copper coins in his outstretched hand. Quartermaster Dick was one of the few fatties in Norland Village. The moment he saw the copper coins, his slightly furrowed eyebrows immediately lifted, and he said with a smile, "Captain Carter, you're right. Looks like today's task is not easy. I heard that he killed 6 orcs yesterday. TSK. I really can't tell that he's a real person. What a hypocrite." Roddy smiled and sighed in his heart. Captain Carter's swordsmanship is very powerful. Those orcs could not even withstand a single blow from him. They're just a bunch of trash. Roddy felt that he was even more hypocritical after saying that. However, he had done this kind of thing many times before, so he did not feel uncomfortable. Dick turned around and busied himself for a while. He brought out 2 bundles of arrows from the warehouse. Roddy quickly went up to help and asked in a low voice, "I have one more thing. Can you help me cut a piece of old leather armor?" "Leather armor? I don't think so." Dick raised his eyelids and stopped moving. He straightened his back and looked at Brendel. Roddy cursed in his heart as he smiled and took out 2 more copper coins. He did not say anything and just stuffed them into Dick's hands. "Ahem. Maybe there are some left. I'll help you look for them." Dick was very arrogant. Roddy could not understand how such a small village could meet such a powerful quartermaster. Did the quartermaster of the Hollier City Knights see himself as a lord? Although that was what he said, he could not change the fact that he was only a scout. Roddy could only admit to himself. Dick soon returned with a palm-sized piece of cowhide and asked, "Will this do?" Roddy quickly thanked him and prepared to cut it himself. He needed cowhide because he needed a strong finger guard to pull the horn bow. The weight of this horn bow was much larger than the scout's standard short bow, and the finger guards for the scouts were made of simple cowhide. That kind of thing could not withstand the power of the horn bow. If the finger guard was not strong enough in battle, the numbness and pain in the fingers would greatly affect the accuracy of the horn bow. He finally found what he wanted, but just as he turned around, Roddy almost bumped into a guy's chest. "What are you doing here, you little bastard? Since when was it your turn to collect things from the quartermaster?" The scolding made Roddy raise his eyebrows. He looked at the guy in front of him and immediately remembered that this was the middle-aged man, Ruger, who had been cursing at him last night. The man was tall and sturdy, with a calm demeanor. When he looked at people with his triangular eyes, there was always a hint of disdain. Perhaps it was because he was used to being arrogant as a scout in the village, but he had never taken a young man like Roddy seriously. At this moment, he did not even bother to look at Roddy. In Roddy's memory, Ruger was the captain of the first scout team and the toughest veteran ruffian in the entire Norland village. His archery and swordsmanship were both good, but because he had experienced the war with the orcs, he appeared arrogant and unreasonable in front of a group of juniors. Although his character was not bad, it was still annoying. Quartermaster Dick did not like Ruger either, but he knew that this guy was not to be trifled with. He awkwardly exchanged a few words and tried to change the topic. But Ruger waved his hand and said, "Don't King play with me." Ignoring Dick's awkward expression, Ruger looked at the horn bow in Roddy's hand. His eyes suddenly lit up, and he reached out to take it. Unexpectedly, Roddy raised his hand, and Ruger grabbed nothing but air. To Lu Go, who had never been provoked by anyone, this action was like a fuse, igniting his firecracker temper in an instant. "Son of Ab*tch, are you rebelling? You can still use a horn bow?" Ruger, the veteran ruffian, was used to speaking ill of people who were lower in status and experience than him. He poked Roddy's chest with his finger and said, "Let me tell you, a bastard like you is only suitable to hunt rabbits. I advise you to give me this kind of thing." Ruger's finger poked his chest, and it hurt a little, but Roddy stood there without moving. He only squinted his eyes slightly. Roddy's gaze stopped on Ruger's captain's badge for a moment. He thought for a while, and then suddenly raised his head. At this moment, the vengeful ranger Roddy seemed to have reappeared from a distant time and space. Although he did not have his usual body and face, his cold aura was clearly felt by Dick. Roddy looked into Ruger's eyes, as if he was staring at a target, and said, "If you can shoot more accurately than me with it, then I will admit your words." His words instantly made the atmosphere turn cold. Dick, who still wanted to play the good guy, immediately shook his head and retreated. He knew that this matter could not be resolved peacefully. Even though he had only killed a few thousand enemies in the game, his persistence in fighting alone for a long time had given Roddy a cold and intimidating aura. Before his rebirth, he was not a high-ranking person like the guild leaders of thousands of guilds. He did not have much prestige. However, the posture that his body subconsciously displayed would inevitably reveal some signs of danger. For a social group like humans, acting alone always had to pay a higher price. But Roddy could survive alone on the dangerous Earth Fisher continent and enter the first echelon of players. This in itself said a lot. One of the most important points was that the bloody battles he had experienced were far more cruel than those group battles of tens of hundreds of people. Lu Gu raised his hand and wanted to snatch the bow away. However, at that moment, Roddy's gaze made his hair stand on end. He was not a recruit and had killed orcs on the battlefield before. That was why he was very sensitive to this kind of aura. For a moment, he even wanted to take a step back. But soon, he cursed in his heart and straightened his chest in disbelief. Chapter 7. Lu Gu was stunned for a moment. Then, he saw the other scouts and villagers surrounding him. He could only give up on trying to snatch the arrow. He remembered that Roddy had put him in a difficult position, so he shouted angrily, "You little bastard! Take your bow to the shooting range and decide the winner with one round of arrows. Let's see who has the right to use it. Let's make this clear. If you lose, you will kneel down and lick my shoes." Roddy didn't say anything. He just looked up slightly and ignored Lu Gu. He bent down to pick up the arrow and walked away. There weren't many people in the village, but they all rushed over when they heard that something was happening. The scout team's mission would only start in an hour, and any commotion in a small village would spread to every corner of the village in less than 10 minutes. Rhodey crossed his arms and stood on the shooting range in the small square. Lu Gu held a blade of grass in his mouth. He held his bow and continued to provoke Rhodey. "Just wait to lick my shoes, little bastard." He had the right to say that. Even in the past, no one in Norland Village was better at archery than Lu Gu. To him, this kind of competition was just a way for Roddy to stall for time. He spat out the straw as if he was spitting at Rhodey. He looked at Rhodey with disdain, and then raised the bow in his hand. The scouts of Norland Village would occasionally have an archery competition. The rules were simple. Shoot at a piece of linen the size of a human head on a haystack from 25 yards away. Each person would shoot 10 arrows, and the winner would be determined by the area covered. Although Lu Gu was always cursing and swearing, as the leader of the scouts, he was definitely not careless in his work. His movements were precise, and his breathing was steady. Lu Gu raised his hand and shot 3 arrows in a row. All of them hit the center of the linen. This precise swordsmanship amazed the farmers around him. However, the strength of the bow was too great. From the 4th arrow onward, the area covered by the arrows gradually increased. By the 7th arrow, Lu Ji's arm was shaking every time he pulled the bow. Even his movements were starting to change. After 12 arrows were shot, 2 of Luger's arrows hit outside the edge of the linen cloth. This was also because the weight of the horn bow was too high. Strong bows and hard crossbows were difficult to control. Even someone like Luge could not maintain high accuracy. However, this result was enough to make the soldiers feel ashamed of their inferiority. The scene of the arrows nailing into the linen cloth was truly frightening. There were 30 to 40 villagers and soldiers around them, and all of them were in an uproar. Many of them said that Roddy was unlucky and that it would be difficult for him to get out of this situation. After all, in their eyes, Lu Gu was the undefeatable party. Thinking of Roddy's past performance in the village, no one thought that he could beat Lu Gu in archery. The public's opinion was on Lu Ji's side, so he couldn't help but straighten his back. He looked at Roddy from the corner of his eyes and spat again. He threw his bow over in disdain. "Little bastard, learn a little." But he would never have thought that the words Roddy said after taking the bow almost made Lu Ji's lungs explode. "Heh! You think this is good archery? This is just the tip of the iceberg." Ignoring Lu Ji's reaction, Roddy wrapped his finger with thin leather and aimed at the target 25 yards away. He adjusted his breathing and slowly raised the bow in his hand. In the next moment, all the scouts frowned. Even the farmers who were watching from the side started whispering. The bow was half drawn, but it was not fully drawn. Roddy's movements looked extremely casual as he raised the bow and shot. This posture was completely unbelievable in the eyes of the scouts. Did he know that he could not win, so he was too lazy to even aim? Speaking of which, the most important thing in archery was consistency. Every time the bow was drawn and released, all the movements had to be highly consistent in order to ensure the same accuracy. If the position of the right hand holding the bowstring or the position of the hand pushing the bow was slightly off, the arrow that was shot out would have a deviation. Therefore, consistent movements, when shooting, was the most basic of common sense. But what about Roddy? The bow was half drawn, and the arm was released almost without any contact. How could the arm that was suspended in midair ensure that the strength of the arrow was the same every time? How could he ensure that the aiming angle was the same? The farmers did not understand what this meant, but all the scouts felt that he was simply fooling around. But in the next moment, the continuous tut, tut sound attracted everyone's attention to the target. At first, they only let out a puzzled sound, but when Roddy finished shooting the first 5 arrows, the puzzled sound turned into uncontrollable exclamations. How is this possible? God! Beads of sweat appeared on Lu Ji's forehead. He even felt goosebumps all over his body. Even though he had thought of countless possibilities, he did not expect to see such a scene in front of him. He had always been arrogant, but at this moment, his mouth was wide open as he looked at the pile of straw not far away. 25 yards away, in the middle of the linen pile, there was only one arrow, and every time Roddy raised his arm and released, the next arrow would hit the tail of the previous arrow, nailing it into the target. The tail of the previous arrow was smashed, and it fell to the ground after being split open. This phenomenon was commonly known as chasing arrows, and Lu Gu often encountered it himself. Once the concentration of arrows was too high, this kind of situation would often occur. To a certain extent, this was also a great proof of one's archery skills, but at this moment everyone saw a shocking fact. Except for the first arrow that hit the center, all of Roddy's arrows were chasing arrows. Tut, tut, tut. When the continuous chasing arrows appeared, the nerves of the audience became a little numb. They no longer thought about whether they could hit the linen pile. Instead, they thought in their hearts, could all 11 arrows catch up to it? Tut! When the last arrow was released, Roddy still had a calm expression on his face. It was a stark contrast to Lu Gu, who had just shot a set of arrows with trembling arms. At this point, because of the continuous chasing arrows, the arrows in the bullseye had been split open, leaving only fragments on the ground. All 12 arrows were shot at the same point. After the oppressive silence, the crowd burst into exclamations. They could not imagine that archery could be done to such an extent. This was simply something that only the elven archers of the bards could do. In the noisy environment, perhaps only Carter and the 2 scouts who had participated in the battle yesterday were not too surprised. They looked at Roddy with complicated gazes, and they did not even know if they should step forward to talk to him. At this moment, Lu Gu had already realized what a mistake he had made. His whole body was trembling, and it was not just because he had lost the bet. His archery skills were not bad, so he could better understand what Roddy's move meant. The horn bow was extremely heavy, but Roddy did not even need to pull it to the limit to achieve such accuracy. This meant that from the beginning to the end, Roddy did not take this competition seriously at all. He had made this competition so casually. Was it really just for the bow? At this moment, when he thought back to what he had just said, Lu Gu suddenly understood what Roddy's gaze meant. It was an indifferent gaze that one would only have when looking at a dead person. He wanted to say something, but he saw that Roddy was already standing in front of him, raising 3 fingers and pointing at his chest. You just poked me 3 times. Although the corners of his mouth were slightly raised, and it looked like he was smiling, the coldness in his eyes made Lu Gu shudder. Looking at the leather boot coming towards him, he immediately realized what this guy wanted to do. Although he was shocked, he was not too nervous. Even if it was a bare-handed fight, who was Lu Gu afraid of? But just as he moved to block, he found that Roddy's foot had strangely changed the direction of his attack, and it landed heavily on his lower abdomen. Bang! Lu Gu, who thought that his combat skills were not bad, was sent flying, and after hovering in the air for half a second, he crashed to the ground. The surrounding villagers' chatter stopped abruptly, but this was just the beginning. Roddy's figure appeared like a ghost in front of Lu Gu, and he forcefully pulled him up from the ground. Then, he punched Lu Ji's stomach. Raising his leg and kneeing, Lu Gu, who had just scolded arrogantly, did not even waste time talking nonsense. He flew backward again, rolled on the ground twice, and fell into shock. After doing all this, Roddy picked up his horn bow, turned around, and left. Not far away, Dick, who was holding the 3 copper coins in his hand, was sweating. He swallowed his saliva as he watched Lu Gu being dragged away by the scouts for treatment. He quickly trotted over and stammered, "Roddy, what else do you want? I'll try my best to get it for you." Roddy looked forward. Just a moment ago, he was still ruthless, but the next moment, he restrained his emotions and put on a gentle smile. If it's possible, I also need a small file. It would be best if you have it. Dick agreed with a head full of cold sweat. When he left, he felt that his legs were very weak. In a place like Norland Village, the most powerful person was a veteran ruffian like Lugu. Not to mention the knights or the guards in Hollier City, to the simple villagers and the soldiers who made a living here, anyone who could defeat Lugu without hesitation was definitely not someone they could afford to offend. Military sanctions? Judicial hearings? Who the F***CK could control a team of less than a dozen scouts at the border? Were they going to complain to Hollier City? Those old men would only care about such trivial matters when they had too much to eat. A fight was a fight, just like how Lugu humiliated Roddy. In a place like this, the strongest fist was the last word. It was because Roddy understood this that he acted so brazenly. Of course, part of it was because of Lu Ji's ridicule, but more importantly, it was because of the plan that Roddy was gradually forming in his heart. The villagers gradually dispersed. Roddy pulled out the arrows that were already useless. He felt a little heartache. He was basically penniless now. According to the memory of this guy called Roddy, he still had some money stored in a rundown house in a village not far away. However, including what he had left, he only had about 30 copper coins. Chapter 8. Roddy frowned as he thought about how to earn money in this remote and desolate place. At the same time, he carefully selected the appropriate arrows from the remaining wooden arrows. The reason why he took so many was because he wanted to find 30 arrows that could ensure the accuracy of his arrows. Every arrow's straightness, roundness, hardness, length and center of gravity were different. As someone who had achieved a small success in archery, Roddy's archery skills were naturally not something an ordinary scout could imagine. At that moment, he was holding the file that Dick had brought and was making fine adjustments to the 30 arrows that he had selected. After grinding the slot at the end of each arrow to the same width, he began to test all the arrows. This time, Roddy's shooting distance was changed to 40 meters. Every time he shot an arrow, his movements would be fixed for a long time, as if he was thinking about something. The 30 arrows were shot in 3 groups. Every time an arrow was pulled out, Roddy would leave a faint mark at the end of each arrow. This action made Dick very curious, but in the end, he resisted the urge to ask. After Roddy changed the broken piece of armor into a simple finger guard, the scout team in the distance was ready to set off. After returning the remaining arrows to Dick, Roddy smiled and carried the horn bow and the 30 arrows to his horse. When Captain Carter saw Roddy, his attitude was a little different from before. At this moment, he no longer put on the airs of a captain. His words were very obviously concerned, almost making people think that he and Roddy were both scout captains. However, Roddy was not interested in being too polite with him. He just listened to Carter's subsequent assignment seriously. Yesterday's orc attack was very sudden. Although we'd won, we also paid a heavy price. Second Lieutenant Sodden has already reported the news to Hollier City. I think the number of scouts will certainly be expanded in the next few days. However, in order to ensure that those damn orcs did not infiltrate into the country, today we will conduct a large-scale investigation. Speaking of which, Carter's behavior could be considered as fulfilling his duty. Although he was not good at martial arts, his mind did not deviate from the right path. Compared to the shitty nobles in Roddy's memory, he was much better. It had to be known that this country had been weak for a long time, and the lords and nobles had their own way of doing things. Less than a quarter of the country belonged to the king, and the rest was divided up by the lords, big and small. As a result, the infighting almost never stopped. In Roddy's memory, the destruction of the kingdom of Karen was due to this group of noble lords who did not forget to trip up each other when they were facing the attacks of the orcs. In the end, they were defeated one after another, and 90% of the old noble families were slaughtered by the orcs. Hearing Captain Carter's words, Roddy woke up from his memories. He raised his head and straightened his chest, listening to Captain Carter's serious explanation of the direction of the investigation. 20 kilometers to the west of Nolan Village, investigate the radiation. If it's safe, continue 10 kilometers to the west after the noon break. Captain, isn't that? The expressions of the team members changed, and they immediately opened their mouths to ask questions, but Carter waved his hand and interrupted them. I know that it's a neutral zone, and there's no need to take responsibility for any accidents. But since these D*MN orcs dared to approach our border, we must make them pay with their blood. Although Carter gave all the scouts the impression that he was a slacker and a wily old fox, the dead soldiers still made a big impact on his heart. Although Carter's ability was not strong, when faced with the orcs' invasion of the border, which was related to the honor of the Lord, he had a lot of passion. His eloquence surprised even Roddy a little. At least in his opinion, this guy was very good at stirring up the emotions of others. As for the royal families of the Kingdom of Karen, most of the scouts had no feelings for them. But for Duke Lucifron, the soldiers adhered to the most basic principle of loyalty. This was also the most obvious difference between this era and the modern era that Roddy used to live in. In this society that was similar to the Middle Ages in Europe, there was no such thing as sovereignty between people. If there was one thing that applied the most, it would be the principle of contract. Most people, such as all the villagers in Norland Village, were the property of the Lord. The Lord provided protection, and the villagers provided taxes and soldiers during the war. At this time, the scouts that Roddy was in were the private soldiers that were loyal to the Duke Lucifron family. Although it was not easy to accept such a concept, Roddy had already gotten used to it after playing the game for so long. At this time, when the team members heard Carter's reprimand, they were also aroused by the courage in their bones, and they all responded loudly, listening to the slogans of these young soldiers. Roddy's mouth curved into a bitter smile. The Kingdom of Karen was considered as an old man in the human kingdom in the land divided. 70 years ago, it was founded by Kuhn the Conqueror. At that time, the royal family was very powerful, and the army in the hands of the king made the orcs, the undead, and the surrounding covetous people tremble in fear. But since then, the country gradually began to decline. The power in the hands of the nobles became more and more powerful, and the voice of the royal family was sharply reduced. Many of the lords were militaristic, and they dragged the country into the quagmire of civil strife. The people at the bottom were suffering unspeakably. However, the people of the Kingdom of Karen always had the courage to never admit defeat in their bones. It was this courage that allowed the kingdom to stand tall under the siege of the orcs and the undead. Even if the kingdom gradually fell into a disadvantageous position, it still stood tall in the face of those covetous people. Although Roddy was only in the game, he had also witnessed the indomitable and resolute people of this huge kingdom during the 7 years when it was falling apart. He had also witnessed the sacrifices of countless people, and he had also seen the unremitting efforts of those who drifted away like smoke and clouds for this country. Although it was just a game, because it was too realistic and three-dimensional, it made a kind of spirit like a totem in Roddy's heart, and it became one of the reasons why he accepted the identity of a scout at this moment without complaining. Do you understand the mission? Captain Carter's words brought Roddy back to reality from his chaotic thought. He immediately replied loudly like all the other team members around him, "Understood, Captain. Then let's go." Carter tidied up his military uniform and the equipment on his warhorse, and signaled the second team of scouts to set off immediately. A group of 7 scouts immediately rode their warhorses out of Norland Village, and began the first large-scale and long-distance reconnaissance in the past 3 years. After getting on the horse, Captain Carter did not forget to look back at Roddy and said, "The position of vice-captain is now vacant. If I die, you will lead the rest of the team and continue forward." His words were a little sudden, But the team members who participated in the battle yesterday remained silent. Roddy held the reins and hesitated for a moment, then nodded his head. He did not know why, but he said something as if he was talking to himself, for the glory of Karen. His words stunned Captain Carter for a moment, and then he felt a little sore in his eyes. The peace had lasted for too long, and the people had long forgotten about the ferocious orcs on the other side of the plains. Carter used to be like that, but it was only yesterday that he suddenly realized that the war was never far away, and he seemed to have embarked on the path of defending the country's dignity today. Would he die? Perhaps. Would he regret it? No. Captain Carter placed his hand on his chest and solemnly saluted. He said in a low voice, "For the glory of Karen." The team moved forward in silence, and the sound of hooves echoed across the empty plains. It was noon and the sun was shining brightly. It was April and the temperature was getting warmer. Occasionally, gray hares could be seen hopping across the endless plains of Nehemia, disappearing into the caves on the ground. Eagles could be seen circling in the sky, and the wind that blew during the day brought with it the unique fresh smell of the plains. Everything seemed to be as peaceful as the scouts had seen it for the past 10 years. However, when the team stopped to rest at noon, Roddy, who had been silent all this while, knew that danger was approaching. Through his memory in the game and Roddy's memory, he had already analyzed the distance between his current position and the outermost village of the Orc territory. There were still 2 years before the launch of the Earthbreaker server. Most of the human players born in the future in the Kingdom of Karen would be distributed in beginner areas like Norland Village. By then, encountering orcs at the borders would be a common occurrence. Villages and towns would have all kinds of quests for the players to complete. Although the number of green-skinned barbarians had not reached that level yet, the battle yesterday had already proved that the orcs had taken action. At this time, the team had already completed their mission of patrolling 20 kilometers of the radiation zone. After the horses rested, they continued to scout the northwest side of the border. In Roddy's memory, there should be one of the 3 forward sentry towers built by the orcs after crossing 2 short grassland slopes. In the previous game, these 3 sentry towers were the frontline supply stations for the orc scouts and stragglers. They were regarded by the Kingdom of Karen as the sharp teeth of the orcs who were trying to bite into the territory of the Empire. But these sentry towers, do they still exist? Judging from the previous attack by the orcs, Roddy could deduce that the orcs must have a stronghold nearby. However, whether it was the sentry tower he remembered in the previous game, he had to confirm it further. He looked at the weapon in his inventory. The short sword with 1-2 attack was almost negligible. This kind of broken equipment could not be considered to have any attack power. As a berserker, he used to use heavy weapons. At this time, this kind of toy, that could not be swung with any strength, was not worth his attention. Equipment was very important to the players in the Earthbreaker, but it did not mean that the stronger the equipment, the stronger the player. A swordsman who had crossed the threshold of level 30 using a short sword with 1-2 attack to kill a player who had not crossed the threshold of level 30 was not a dream. It was a fact. The higher the level, the higher the attribute. However, what was more important was the skill bonus and the player's understanding of the profession. As a ranger in his previous life, Roddy had crossed the threshold of level 30 and was infinitely close to level 60. This showed that his outstanding talent was not just a rumor. At this moment, the horn bow in his hand with 7-12 damage was already considered the best among level 1 long-range weapons. Combined with the +1 damage arrow, if it hit a vital point such as the head, Roddy could be sure that the critical hit value would be more than 100 points. The fluctuations in the damage in Earthbreaker were very large. It was not like a normal online game where one slash would deduct HP according to the interface. If an arrow pierced through the head, the damage would fluctuate by 10 times. If the sword was deflected by plate armor, sometimes it would not even deduct HP. So from a certain point of view, pure absolute strength did not represent a person's strength. More importantly, it was the person's skills. Thinking about the marked arrows, Roddy, who was once level 59 and had the title of Shadow Hunter, felt at ease. In his heart, he carefully thought about when to get more suitable equipment. "Guys, get ready to go." Captain Carter ended his break at the right time. After the scouts were equipped with their weapons, they turned around and mounted their horses. The group of 7 continued their journey towards the western border of the Orc Kingdom. At this moment, their faces gradually became solemn. Ahead of them was the border between the Orc Kingdom and the Kingdom of Karen, the central buffer zone. Here, anything that happened would not affect the agreement signed by the two kingdoms. Here, they had lost the last thing they could rely on in their hearts. They also had to abandon the most childish fantasies. Once they encountered the orcs, both sides would definitely fight each other without any hesitation. Life and death would be decided by the heavens. Roddy held the reins in his hand, his eyes staring at the low slope in the distance. Captain Carter, who was leading the team in front, turned his head back. He wanted to see something from this guy who had suddenly become so strong that he could not even fathom his strength. However, he could not capture any information from Roddy's expression. However, as they climbed up the low slope on the grassland, the cry of the scout at the front made his expression turn serious. In the distance, on the grassland that should have been unusually empty, there was a camp. About a dozen animal skin tents were arranged in a circle. Dried cured meat was hung outside the simple and crude tent. In the middle of the tents there was a crooked wooden tower. Figures in 2s and 3s were walking in the tower. The characteristics of their burly bodies immediately stunned the scouts. Everything indicated that this camp was an outpost built by the orcs. Roddy looked at the scene in front of him. The outpost that occupied more than 10 acres of land and had a tall sentry tower in his memory gradually overlapped with the crude camp in front of him. Chapter 9. Roddy was sure that the orc camp in front of him was the first sharp tooth that the orcs had extended to the kingdom of Karen. Because of its existence, the orcs would gradually encroach on the border villages of the kingdom of Karen in the next few years. About 3 years later, when the kingdom was in civil strife, the orcs would start a large-scale invasion. Roddy was determined to save the kingdom. Although he was hot-blooded, he understood that he was not qualified to explain the far-reaching significance of this inconspicuous camp to others. After all, he was only a level 1 soldier. If he casually said some alarmist words, who would believe him? He needed strength. He needed the right to speak. He needed to become stronger. Thinking of the shock he gave these scouts at the shooting range today, Roddy coughed softly and said, "This should be a typical small orc camp. According to the number of tents, there should be about 28 to 34 people. There are traces of a simple animal pen outside the camp. This proves that there are wolf riders and there are about 8 of them. The enemy's combat power is not strong. Moreover, the wolf riders have gone out to patrol. There should be about 20 people left to guard the camp." These words shocked the group of scouts. Although they could occasionally see the orcs from afar at the border, or they could get some information about the barbarians from the rumors that were passed down, none of them could really make such an accurate judgment with just a glance. On top of that, they clearly remembered Roddy's appearance the day before. He was a coward who turned pale in fear when he saw a wild wolf. How could he have the calmness of a veteran who could make a judgment at that moment? However, when they thought about how Roddy had shot all 12 arrows at the same spot and how he had beaten up Rouge, they had no choice but to believe that Roddy was not as simple as they thought. I mean, if we attack, do you think we have a chance of winning?" As the captain, Carter wanted to say a few words to maintain his prestige. But obviously, he was not confident enough. He simply changed his tone and asked politely. Roddy frowned and looked forward. He thought for a moment and answered cautiously, I think we have no hope of fighting them head-on. There is also the possibility of encountering the orcs' cavalry at any time. The wolf riders usually don't go too far, because before he finished his sentence, he suddenly turned his head. When the scouts were confused, he suddenly pulled the reins and said hurriedly, Quick! Go down. Don't stay here. Carter frowned, but he did not hesitate and followed Roddy down the grassy slope. They hid out of sight of the orcs' camp. But the military quality of the group was not as good as Roddy thought. 2 scouts' riding skills were not good enough. They commanded the horses for a long time, but they still could not get down from the top of the slope. Roddy thought to himself, this is bad. Although he did not see anything strange, he could not forget the unique sound of the warg's footsteps. This proved that the orc cavalry was approaching. Although the orcs here were only level 2 to 4 trash in his memory, the cavalry was the nightmare of all new players. Their mobility was strong. Once they were attacked by the wolf riders, normal players would not be able to resist if they did not have enough long-range power. Even level 10 soldiers with heavy shields would not be able to resist the charge of the wolf riders. Damn it! Roddy heard the warg's footsteps in the distance and knew that the other party had discovered them. He did not continue to hide and immediately shouted, Get out of here! Quick, quick, quick! At this time, Roddy did not care about letting Carter give the order. He knew that if he was a step late, the whole army would be wiped out. His words unconsciously carried the power of the former shadow hunter, causing the soldiers to unconsciously obey him. He looked into the distance and immediately sorted out a reasonable escape route according to his memory. He turned his head and shouted, I know the safe escape route. Follow me. Don't look back. Carter obviously knew who was the most reliable at this time. He instinctively responded, Everyone, follow me. The team immediately set off. Just as their warhorses started to speed up, a group of black figures suddenly appeared on a slope in the distance. The orcs' wolf riders really did outflank them as Roddy had expected. Those warg wolves were not as tall as the warhorses, but they had the sturdy bodies of calves. Together with the fierce orc warriors on their backs, they looked very imposing. Hearing the strange sound behind them, the scouts turned their heads and were immediately scared out of their wit. They immediately kicked their horses' abdomens and followed closely behind the team. The 3 scouts who had just joined the second team did not understand why Captain Carter would listen to Roddy's words. Now they really understood the reason. The number of these wolf riders was actually as accurate as Roddy had predicted. No more, no less. There were exactly 8 of them. A lingering fear rose from the bottom of their hearts. If it were not for Roddy's decisive order, they would have been chased down the slope by those fellows. Thinking of this, the scouts could not help but feel grateful to Roddy. However, when they turned their heads, they found that the route Roddy was taking was a little strange. They did not understand why the safe route to leave, mentioned by Roddy, were all rugged slopes. Logically speaking, shouldn't the fastest route for the horses be on a gentle slope? What they did not know was that although the orcs' wolf riders were very powerful in short distances, their endurance was far less than that of the warhorses. At this moment, the scouts were basically climbing a slope. Due to their size, the wolf riders would be even slower when climbing a slope. The advantage of short-distance pursuit had been greatly reduced. If they could not catch up with the orcs within a kilometer, the warhorses would definitely be able to leave the exhausted wolf riders far behind on the flat road. Due to the long period of peace, the Kingdom of Karen had long forgotten the combat methods and characteristics of these orcs. However, Roddy was very clear about it. There was another reason why he chose to go up the slope. The wolf riders were not only unparalleled in their charge, they also had a powerful skill called casting net. Once the running warhorses were caught in the net, the outcome was obvious. Therefore, at this moment, when they were on the slope, the wolf rider's casting net skill was also restricted. This inadvertently allowed the scouts to avoid another major risk. Roddy's seemingly simple tactical command contained a lot of battle wisdom. It was not something that Carter and the others could think of in a short period of time. At this moment, he took the lead and crossed the last part of the long uphill journey. He then led the team down an extremely long slope. When the slope appeared, the orc wolf riders, who had been suppressed and unable to catch up, finally saw an opportunity. The leader roared and tried to sprint to catch up. However, he found that his own wolf was actually unable to keep up. Even in the process of descending the slope, he was somewhat out of breath and stuck out his tongue. Therefore, they could only watch as the distance between them and the human scouts widened again. For a moment, they could not help but cry out in frustration. However, the arrogance and stubbornness in the bones of the orcs prevented the wolf riders from giving up. After a long downhill journey, Roddy had already confirmed the identity of the other party. They were all black wolf riders. They should be part of the orc army of Rohal's Hammer. Their status was similar to Roddy's. However, the orc kingdom was a tribal system. Their chief was similar to the duke who was currently in charge of Hollier. They were both people with real power, and the scope of their power was even greater than that of the duke. Simple clothes, rusty machetes, and unarmored wolf riders. Roddy had already determined that these guys were no more than level 5. They were the lowest level of the wolf riders. However, with the impact of the wolf riders, the attack power of these orcs was at least 4 to 5 times that of ordinary orcs. It would not be easy to finish them off. Roddy was not surprised at the other party's relentless pursuit. After dealing with the orcs for so long, he had long understood the temperament of these green-skinned barbarians. So he immediately decided to lead the orc scouts up the slope again. The advance of the orc scouts slowed down a little, and the wolf riders immediately closed the gap. They let out strange cries and excitedly chased after Jiang Yi. However, when they stepped onto the slope and looked up, they suddenly realized that they seemed to have been controlled by the opponent. In front, Roddy's team had reached the top of the slope, and immediately took the initiative to turn. The leader of the wolf riders at the bottom of the long slope sensed that something was wrong. Just as he was about to give an order to the wolf riders beside him, he saw the human leader suddenly straighten his back and raise an orc-style horn bow in his hand. In the next moment, before the leader of the orcs could react, an arrow had already pierced through his sturdy chest. Because the wolf rider was charging forward, the power of the arrow was increased. The huge momentum caused his body to fall backwards, and he lost his balance in an instant, falling straight down the wolf rider. Chapter 10. The fact that the wolf rider captain was killed by the enemy's arrow was right in front of them, but the rest of the orcs didn't seem to be able to react for a while. When they looked back at their leader's corpse in surprise, they forgot to make tactical evasive maneuvers, so, with a sound like a watermelon exploding, another orc with a hole in his head instantly fell to the ground. Not only the orc scout, but everyone, including Captain Carter, was also dumbfounded. They didn't expect Roddy to counterattack in this situation. The ability of mounted archery was not something that could be achieved just by saying it. The bumpy horses, the difference between uphill and downhill, the fast-moving route, the crosswind speed. Under the influence of these factors, even a veteran like Rudy would not be able to shoot accurately from a medium to long distance. But when he thought of Roddy's previous performance of chasing 9 arrows, Captain Carter habitually accepted this illusory reality in front of him. When he was about to raise his bow and arrow to attack, he heard Roddy, who shot the 3rd arrow, yell, "Keep going, don't stop." Poof! The 3rd arrow hit the shoulder of a mount wolf, causing it to roll to the ground along with the orc rider behind it. Within a few seconds of Roddy's counterattack, the 8 wolf riders lost almost half of their combat power, and the remaining 5 orcs slowly stopped their pursuit under the deterrence of Roddy's terrifying and accurate archery, their leader and adjutant died on the spot under Roddy's arrows. There was no way to save them, and they were all killed in one shot. Only the third arrow hit the Mount Wolf, but at the same time, it broke the arm of the fallen orc warrior, and he also lost the ability to fight. The beastmen, who had always considered themselves to be superior in battle, suddenly felt a sense of fear in their hearts. They had never thought that the human in front of them would be able to suppress an entire troop of wolf riders so easily. The accurate archery was like the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads, causing the wolf riders who had lost their leader to hesitate and stop their pursuit, completely giving up on advancing forward. But just when they were about to turn around to rescue their fallen comrade, they heard the increasingly intense sound of horse hooves coming from behind. Never in their wildest dreams would the orcs have thought that these cowardly humans would actually turn around and attack them. This time, the 5 orc wolf riders were going downhill, and almost all of them stopped in their tracks. On the other hand, the scout who reappeared on the slope on his warhorse assumed a charging stance. He raised the longsword in his hand and aimed his horse's head straight at the wolf riders who did not have the time to turn around to face him. There was a huge disparity in morale between the two armies, and there was a huge geographical difference. Moreover, because Roddy's position was directly in the direction of the sun, the orcs who wanted to see their position had to face the glaring sunlight to look for the enemy. At that moment, the 3 major factors of timing, geography, and manpower were all in Roddy's hands. So he did not hesitate to lead the scouts in a terrifying charge with their morale soaring. Although they were the poorly equipped private scouts of the nobles, although they were just useless soldiers who had been riding on horses for many years, although their horsemanship was not very good, and their swordsmanship was not very good, but at that moment they were all instantly fired up by the words that Roddy shouted first. Carter, who was following behind Roddy, felt as if his heart was about to jump out of his chest. He took a deep breath and shouted the slogan that he had not said for a long time, "For the glory of Cullen." This sentence was like a shot of adrenaline, giving the scouts a powerful strength that made their scalps go numb from excitement. It was as if even the weakest person would be filled with courage, and even the most cowardly soldier would dare to pick up a sword and cut off the enemy's head. The distance of 30 meters was covered in just a breath's time. Roddy, who used to be a berserker, brandished the long sword in his hand without any fear. The blade swept past the orc, who could not dodge in time, and directly split the shoulder of the orc, who could not dodge in time. Carter and the rest of the scouts shouted loudly. Although their movements were clumsy, they miraculously cut down 3 wolf riders. These orcs no longer had any morale to speak of. They only cared about parrying with their swords and did not have the will to fight back. In a single move, they were cut down to the ground like melons and vegetables. The scouts who had charged past the orc team made a half circle. At this time, there was only 1 orc left alive. Seeing the situation, he completely lost the will to fight and turned to run. However, in the next moment, he was shot in the back by Roddy's amazing arrow from 70 meters away, and he fell to the ground and rolled down the low slope. Even though it was a heavy bow with a high initial speed, it still took nearly 2 seconds for the arrow to hit the target. At this time, Carter and the others gradually understood what true archery was. Because when Roddy shot this arrow, he was riding on the back of a horse and was moving like the orc in the distance. So this arrow meant that Roddy had perfectly calculated the terrain, wind speed, the enemy's movement and the speed of the arrow, and accurately shot the enemy. Carter and the others asked themselves, in this situation they would not even know where the arrow they shot would land, let alone hit the enemy's heart. And Roddy's amazing arrow also announced the end of the battle. Carter calculated. From the beginning of the enemy's pursuit to the completion of the clean counterattack, the total time had not even been 5 minutes. And the result? All 8 orc wolf riders were dead, and the scouts had no casualties. Dismount. Collect the spoils of war. Captain Carter's expression was extremely excited, and even the rest of the team had the same expression. The reason for this was because they had achieved a charge that only the legendary knights could achieve. Although they did not hold long spears, wore heavy armor, and did not have a neat formation, they had actually cut down the 2-meter-tall orc wolf riders riding on Mount Wolves. This would probably be a topic of conversation for the rest of their lives. Roddy did not let down his guard. As he rode on the back of the horse, he raised his bow and shot a few arrows continuously, killing all the Mount Wolves. At this time, Carter, who was at the side, realized that every time Roddy shot an arrow, he would use his finger to pinch the fine mark on the tail of the arrow. His eyes lit up, thinking that it was some secret archery technique, so he asked curiously, "What are those engravings on the arrow shafts?" "Markings that need to be adjusted when shooting." Roddy retracted his gaze from the last Mount Wolf that had fallen. His cold and focused expression disappeared, and was replaced with a calm and friendly one. He replied, "Every arrow is different, so I need to know how much error there will be when I shoot different arrows. Previously, when I borrowed 50 arrows, I picked and marked them. It was to achieve the highest accuracy." This truth made Carter speechless, and he could not accept it for a moment. He had never thought that after reaching this level of archery, he would be able to be so accurate that every arrow had to be marked. "You see, I can chase 9 out of 10 arrows, but that's because the distance is too close, and I can basically completely ignore the error of the arrows. But the further the distance, the more unstable the conditions, and the harder it is to ensure the accuracy of the arrows. Beyond 50 meters, even the slightest difference in each arrow will cause an error." For example, his head. Roddy had already ridden in front of the orc corpse that he had shot through the head with an arrow. If I did not adjust according to the error of the arrows, I might have only shot through his ear. Carter swallowed his saliva, and he was completely speechless. He felt that the person in front of him was a freak, and everything that he had done was beyond the scope of his understanding. Dismounting from his horse, the scout leader felt that it would be more reassuring for him to clean up the corpses with the other scouts. And Roddy also dismounted from his horse, and looked at the scattered corpses on the ground, and frowned slightly. Then, an inexplicable feeling spread throughout his body. It was as if his body was filled with strength. The increase in various attributes allowed him to clearly experience the feeling of his strength increasing. He glanced at his HP again. As expected, it was indeed effective. Chapter 11. A breeze blew across the grassland, and the smell of blood gradually dissipated. The afternoon sun was a little cruel, and the green was dotted with red blood from the corpses. It seemed to be silently announcing the seed of violence in this peaceful grassland. After the battle just now, the tired warhorses needed a break. The map in Roddy's mind told him that they were now far away from the camp, and would not encounter any other threats for the time being. So after retrieving the arrows that could be retrieved, he began to organize the spoils of war. After a long time, the soldiers gradually calmed down from their nervousness and excitement. Carter led them to cut off the heads of all the orcs, and at the same time, cut off the tails of the wargs and peeled off their fur. This was a token to prove the identity of the orcs. After all, no one would believe that a small scout team could kill 8 wolf riders without any casualties. Roddy took 2 orc curved swords as spoils of war from the collected weapons. Logically speaking, Carter should be the first to choose the spoils of war, but at this time, no one had any objections. Carter even directly expressed his admiration and recognition of Roddy in front of the team. Carter of course knew that it was because of the young man in front of him that he survived 2 encounters with the orcs. Although he could choose to calmly accept the military merits that Roddy pushed to him like yesterday, but now that he faced these orcs again, he understood that instead of living in the vanity of fake merits, It was better to truly gallop on the battlefield with his comrades and fearlessly charge towards the enemy. After the real experience of killing orcs, he understood that the so-called honor in his previous view of life was too ridiculous. Originally, Roddy was wondering if he should give the credit to Carter, but in the end, because of Carter's attitude, he did not say his thoughts out loud. In fact, the plan in his mind was too big. Just one night was not enough for him to completely sort it out. But he was very clear about the purpose of dealing with the orcs. Thinking of this, Roddy more or less understood his next route. He looked at Carter and the other scouts who were still a little excited. He knew that these people were happy, but for his next goal, Roddy decided to pour a bucket of cold water on them. I have many ways to make the beastmen suffer, but what I want to say is, how many beastmen can our team stop? They had killed 8 wolf riders today. Tomorrow, another 8 or even 18 of them might appear. Everyone could see what they were planning. The campsite they saw today was a sign that they were ready to extend their claws and fangs to the kingdom of Karen. Today we were lucky to win. But what about in the future? His tone was very calm and indifferent, but it carried an indescribable sense of cruelty. The scouts, who were originally in high spirits, were stunned. The flames that had just been ignited in their hearts seemed to have been extinguished with a "chee" sound. They stared blankly at Roddy, not knowing what to do. I know it's not the right time to say this, but Second Lieutenant Sodden will not bring the so-called reinforcements. The kingdom will not pay attention to the friction that happened in our place. In the eyes of those lords, everything we do, including risking our lives to fight for the kingdom's honor, is just a play in their eyes. Thinking of the scenes in the game, Roddy could not help but feel a little down. At that time, the border was frequently attacked, but Hollier City did not make any effective counterattack. In the end, when the surrounding villages were all slaughtered by the orcs, Hollier City did not even dare to open its gates to let the refugees take refuge. Later on, the city was destroyed and families perished. You must be joking. How could this be? The evidence of the orcs and the wolf riders will definitely make people feel strange. Although Carter said so, when he thought of the few times he came into contact with the upper class, he really did not feel confident. Those nobles who only knew how to eat, drink, and have fun all day seemed to really not care about the life and death of small characters like them. Of course, these are all my deductions. Captain Carter, today's mission should be considered completed, right? Why don't we go back and listen to Second Lieutenant Sodden's news? Seeing so many orc heads, he should reward us with some wine money. Roddy knew that he could not let the mood of the team become too negative, so he hung the 2 thick curved swords on the side of the saddle and changed the topic. Carter understood tacitly and did not say anything more. He quietly turned around and mounted his horse, leading the team back to Norland Village. Although they had won the battle, the scouts who should have been excited and happy were a little silent. On horseback, Roddy's expression was a little indifferent. He silently followed the team, and although he did not pull away from the others, he always gave off a feeling of loneliness. This was perhaps the unique temperament of every ranger. Can I save this country? Roddy, who had been reborn, was thinking about this complicated and huge problem. He listed out his advantages: the terrifying archery that people would envy, the deep understanding of those historical events, the knowledge of all kinds of aspects of this game, the memory of all the changes in this kingdom in the next 10 years. All of these could make Roddy a sharp weapon to quickly exert his power. But when he recalled that he had to use all of his skills to kill 8 wolf riders of the lowest level, Roddy's heart began to waver. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands of orcs. Just the problem of the feudal lord within the kingdom of Karen alone was enough to give him a headache. Could such a huge country change its course of history because of a variable like him? Could he really be the butterfly that flapped its wings? For Norland Village, this was just one of the most peaceful days of the countless days. Old Finch's shepherd dog barked excitedly because of the sound of the scout's horse hooves returning from afar. The sun slowly sank into the horizon, and there was smoke floating in the air. No one knew who was making cheese. The slightly sour and stinky smell drifted far away, but it made the mouths of a few children in the village full of saliva. Blacksmith Stan was still hammering, and Dick of the military supply department secretly drank 2 mouthfuls of Aunt Susan's ale. He was lying on the haystack next to the warehouse, staring blankly with a straw in his mouth. Compared to the past, the only unexpected thing today was that the scout team returned to the village 2 hours later than usual. When the scouts riding on war horses entered the village entrance, many people raised their heads and looked at the group of soldiers who seemed to be a little different from usual. When Carter returned with a sack of orc heads, the villagers had already felt a hint of gloominess at the border. Now, when they saw the 7 scouts with serious expressions dismounting from their horses without saying a word, they could not help but feel a little nervous. Did something happen again? The beastmen's heads were no longer kept in bags. Instead, they were strung up naked with rope. The soldiers participated in the charge and melee combat, and they now had a murderous aura about them. Their expressions were no longer as relaxed and playful as before. Instead, there was only solemnity and killing intent. Among these people, there was one person who seemed to stand out. The 7 scouts dismounted, but none of them immediately unloaded their equipment. Instead, they all looked at the guy who used to be the least outstanding in the team. Even Captain Carter was almost instinctively looking at Roddy at this moment, as if waiting for an order. This was prestige. The soldiers who fought with their lives on the line always had this kind of confidence in the strong. "Why are you looking at me?" Roddy blinked his eyes, but he did not have the serious look he had on the battlefield. He looked at his comrades innocently, shrugged and said, "We're home. Have a good rest, everyone. Let's see what Second Lieutenant Sodden has to say." This sentence was like an order to dismiss, and everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Even Captain Carter did not have any objection to Roddy's behavior. He looked at the scattered scouts, picked up the orc's head and the wolf's tail, and stood there for a moment, as if he had made a decision in his heart. He strode to catch up with Roddy, indicating that he would bring him to Second Lieutenant Sodden. "Hey, Carter, you actually encountered orcs again?" A few soldiers of the first scout team passed by and saw the 8 orc heads that were threaded together. They immediately widened their eyes and shouted in surprise. Then, the entire first scout team came over to look. Not far away, Ruger sat quietly in the corner, squinting his eyes and looking in their direction. If it was in the past, Carter would definitely have loudly told everyone how dangerous the battle was. After all, in terms of eloquence, he was the best in the whole scout team. But this time, Carter did not have the slightest intention to brag. After this battle, he had unconsciously restrained himself a lot. The battle of life and death just now had left an indelible impression in his mind, so he did not attach as much importance to vanity as he did in the past. Carter waved his hand to indicate that it was fine. He did not even want to answer, and walked into the courtyard where Second Lieutenant Sodden was at with Roddy. His subconscious action of walking beside Roddy made Ruger, whose face was still bruised, slightly narrow his eyes. This veteran spat and was about to say a few words like "spineless," but then he saw the dark wolf tails next to the orc heads. Wolf! Wolf riders! The pain in his body had not faded, but at this moment, Ruger forgot to resent Roddy. He stared at the wolf tails in Carter's hand with a stiff expression, and for a moment, his words were stuck in his throat. Chapter 12. Roddy and Carter walked straight into Sodden's room and noticed that the commander did not look too good. Usually, this kind of expression meant that the 2 scout teams would not have a good time for the next 3 days. Sodden was a typical good-for-nothing. He was not very capable, had a bad temper, loved to eat and loved to make achievements. Basically, he did not lack any shortcomings. In Rhodey's memory, this idiot used his father's identity as a squire of a knight to get his current useless military rank. Although he had a military rank, he could only be considered as someone who got paid by the army. Everyone knew that when Sodden's father died on the battlefield, he was only 8 years old. His father, who was a skilled squire, did not have the time to pass on anything to him before Sodden's mother became a widow. 2 years later, Sodden died of illness. His broken family did not teach Sodden how to work hard, but in the end, it made him ambitious and disliked hard work. Sodden had planned to claim credit with a sack of orc heads, but after thinking about it, he felt that it was not enough for him to be promoted. He was the kind of person who did not do anything but was greedy for credit and resentful when he did not get what he wanted. At this moment, Sodden was indignant that Carter and the others did not kill more orcs yesterday and had nowhere to vent his anger. But when he saw the string of orc heads in Carter's hand, his eyes lit up and his bad mood immediately changed. He asked in surprise, "You killed so many orcs again?" "Yes, sir. These are the corpses of 8 orc wolf riders Carter wanted to say something, but Sodden didn't seem to have any intention of waiting for him to say anything. Ignoring the smell of blood, he rushed forward and snatched the necklace of heads. He patted Carter's shoulder and said, 1, 2, 3, 8. I didn't know you were so strong before. Are orcs really so weak? Sodden, who had never been on the battlefield, naturally did not understand the danger of this battle. Carter's mentality had changed a lot. He could not help but feel a sense of disgust towards Sodden. Not only did he hate Sodden's undisguised greed, but he also hated himself for being similar to Sodden. These are 8 orc wolf riders, sir. Carter did not reply in a flattering manner like he did in the past. Instead, he revealed a faint sense of alienation. We discovered an orc camp in the northwest and were pursued by them. But in the end we took care of these wolf riders. Well done. Sodden did not realize the importance of Carter's words. At that moment, he was only thinking about how many silver coins and military merits he could exchange for these orcs' heads. Sodden interrupted Carter with a few words of praise and small talk. After that, he signaled Carter to leave. As for Rhodey, he did not even look at him from the beginning to the end. Carter felt extremely awkward. He admitted that he was not very capable, and he also admitted that he liked to talk big. Sometimes he was even proud of his good interpersonal skills. But at this moment, he felt that no matter how much he tried to flatter Sodden in the past, the result he got was really disgusting. Carter came from a humble background, but that didn't mean he was an ungrateful person. He brought Roddy here because he recognized Roddy's efforts and status. Today's battle had thoroughly proved Roddy's ability. Roddy would be far more suitable to be a leader than Carter himself. But Carter wanted it, but Sodden didn't. This dog sh*T second lieutenant didn't even understand the importance of discovering an orc camp. Carter was worried that the nobles would ignore this news like Roddy said. But now, it seemed that not only the nobles, even AF** King's second lieutenant didn't have the brains to pay attention to this important news. He turned to look at Roddy and found that the young man didn't seem anxious or angry. He just looked down and shook his head. Carter sighed helplessly. The two didn't say anything else and left together. Sodden was left alone looking at the orc heads and wondering if he could be promoted to first lieutenant. I didn't think, sigh. Carter wanted to smile bitterly when he walked out of the house, but his voice was very dry. The words he wanted to say turned into a sigh. The kingdom of Karen has experienced too much peace. People are unwilling to face war. They would rather deceive themselves when war is coming. It's normal. Roddy remembered the quests in the beginner's village in the kingdom of Karen when the Earthbreaker server was launched a year later. The information in the quests showed that even when the orcs were wreaking havoc at the border, the people of the kingdom of Karen still didn't believe that the orcs would really invade. They only thought that it was the radical behavior of a small number of orcs. After the kingdom of Karen defeated the orcs, they signed an agreement that stated that the orcs were not allowed to step into the territory of the kingdom of Karen. People naively believed that the orcs wouldn't go against the kingdom of Karen. Facts had proven that any war was the eruption of accumulated contradictions. The so-called fuse was just a small matter that was not worth mentioning at all, because what was bound to happen would always happen. Just like people who got into a fight because of a quarrel, cursing each other fiercely before was just to find an excuse for themselves to be even more ruthless. Roddy understood that the orcs would eventually invade, but he could not announce to the world that it would happen. It was still the same thing. Who would take a scout's wild guess seriously? Carter silently returned to the village with Roddy. Today's mission had come to an end. The scouts were not as strict as the cavalry regiment or Hollier's elite troop. The soldiers were more leisurely. Other than eating, sleeping, and patrolling the borders, their only entertainment was gambling. The soldiers were penniless, and they only had a few copper coins to win or lose. They were poor, and they couldn't even go to a brothel if they wanted to. This was Kirk's village, and if they didn't want to lose their jobs, they wouldn't dare to bully others. At most, they would say a few dirty words in front of the widows in the village. But these soldiers, who usually seemed to have nowhere to vent their energy, were frighteningly silent today. When Carter and Roddy walked into the dining shed, the scouts of the second team stood up together, as if waiting for some news. "Everyone, I have something to say today." Carter did not have the demeanor of a leader, and his current position was not even that of a leader. But at this moment, his words made the eyes of the scouts of the two teams turn to look at him. This did not bring him any sense of vanity. Instead, it made him feel even more bitter. His eyelids drooped slightly, and his voice was a little hoarse as he said, "We are a group of scouts who earn a living. We are all risking our lives to earn this meager amount of military pay. In fact, no one is more noble than anyone else. Today we killed a group of orc wolf riders. Many people may not understand what this means, but I remember clearly who led our brothers back from that kind of situation." The scouts of the first team did not know what was going on, but when they thought of the string of heads that Carter carried today and the words "Wolf Riders," they all remained silent. Second Lieutenant Sodden did not think that those orcs were a threat. He did not even care about the news of the camp's appearance. But I believe what Roddy said. Those are orcs. They are not humans. These bastards of orcs will sooner or later stretch their fangs out to us, to Norland Village, and even Hollier City. Carter lowered his head and slowly took off the scout leader badge on his chest. He raised his head and looked at his comrades in front of him. He suddenly felt a sense of heroism. Let's not talk about other things. Roddy has led us to victory, and leading us to make the right decision. I think he can do the same. Turning around, Carter pinned the team leader badge on Roddy's chest, and then stood at attention, giving a very solemn military salute. The meaning of this series of actions was clear to everyone. But to be able to make Carter make such a firm decision, Roddy was also very impressed in his heart. As a modern person, Roddy's concepts of those who are capable and abdicate were too advanced compared to the feudal society of the divided land. He could not completely understand what Carter was giving up when he did this, but he instinctively felt that it was not easy to make a person who could only be at the bottom of society for the rest of his life give up the little power in his hands. The soldiers who looked at Roddy and Carter were silent for a moment, but they did not have any objections. Lug, who was sitting in the corner, roughly understood what had happened. He sighed helplessly and asked, "Can you explain to us?" This was already very polite words. When had Lug ever treated Carter or Roddy like this? But whether it was the beating that Roddy gave him today or the victory that the scout team had in the past 10 years in the afternoon, to a veteran like Lug, it had an indescribable meaning. Unlike Carter, Lug was not a newbie, nor was he the deceiving second lieutenant Sodden. From a certain point of view, he was the only veteran in Norland Village who had seen the power of the Wolf Riders. So no matter how much conflict he had with Roddy, in the face of the threat of the orcs, they had to work together. As the captain of the first scout team, Lug had always been in a state of opposing the captain of the second team. He looked down on those childish young people, but after hearing Carter's words, his sharp and unyielding eyes turned to look at Roddy. He was not surprised, but more like he was sizing him up. Lug, who still had bruises on his face, had a bad temper, but this also proved that he was a straightforward person. "You guys killed 8 wolf riders? No losses?" Carter knew that the conflict between the two of them this morning would not be resolved easily, so he immediately explained the whole battle in detail. After that, all the scouts looked at Roddy in a completely different way. Even Lug was momentarily absent-minded. He seemed to remember something. His tightly pursed lips and closed eyes showed that this memory was probably a pain that would last him for the rest of his life. When he opened his eyes again, his face seemed to be more haggard than before. He looked at Carter and asked in a low voice, "What did that Sodden guy say?" "Him?" He was only thinking about how many military merits those heads could be exchanged for. Carter snorted coldly, and the scouts around him could not help but feel a little angry and dissatisfied. "The problem we have to face now is, the orcs are building a camp 30 kilometers away. If we let them finish building their outpost, I'm afraid that Norland Village will be attacked by those beasts sooner or later." Carter's face was gloomy. When he thought of Sodden's attitude, he was a little angry. "I didn't want to believe Roddy's deduction at first, but now it seems that I have no other choice." Roddy saw Lug's reaction. He knew that although the beating in the morning had made Lug suffer a lot, it had definitely played a big role now. At least the whole scout team had started to treat him as the center. Roddy did not expect Carter to give up. In fact, he had already planned to use all kinds of means to get the position of team leader. If Lug dared to object, he would find a chance to make him completely convinced. But now it seemed that the reactions of these two people were much better than he had imagined. It seemed that the next step of his plan would not be difficult to achieve. For his own purpose, Roddy deliberated for a while and said in a serious tone, "The second lieutenant did not give any specific orders, so our mission will continue." Hearing this, the scouts seemed to be relieved, but their faint expectations were also dashed. But what Roddy said next made them suddenly raise their heads. Chapter 13. Roddy narrowed his eyes and explained his plan in a low voice. "Without the Wolf Riders, the Orc camp won't be able to replenish their manpower in a short period of time. In other words, they will be empty in the next few days. I think, if we carry out a surprise attack, then we might be able to pull out this nail and make those orcs scram." These words seemed to be to Lu Ji's liking. Although he was still angry at Roddy for beating him up, if the truth was as Roddy said, he didn't mind letting go of the secondary conflict and resolutely fighting against the main conflict together. After all, he still wanted to avenge his fallen comrades. If Roddy could really make him kill those damn orcs, Lu Gu would be willing to take 10 beatings, let alone one. "You said that there are more than 20 orcs in the camp. Then, even if we attack together, we have no hope of winning. Don't tell me that you only know how to talk. I believe that you can kill the Wolf Riders, but how can we kill a whole camp of orcs? Can we kill them?" This was a very objective question. No matter how glib Roddy was, he couldn't avoid it. To be honest, Lu Gu still hoped that the kid in front of him could think of a way. Killing 8 Wolf Riders today had actually made him understand that Roddy's ability was not limited to this. But he had to give himself a reason to stand up and avenge his former comrades. It's been a long time since the kingdom has had any dealings with the orcs. Many people have forgotten their weaknesses and the strengths of us humans. Or rather, we seem to have forgotten the most important point. That is, the orcs are not as strong as you think. Roddy's words were a little sarcastic. In the past 30 years, there had been many conflicts and battles at the border, but without exception, the humans had always made concessions. Because there was no lord leading the army, in small-scale battles, the humans who didn't have any formations or tactics could not defeat the strong orcs. At this point, others might not understand what he meant, but Lu Gu raised his eyebrows thoughtfully. Why can I easily kill these orcs? Why didn't we suffer any losses in today's battle? Roddy did not use a sarcastic tone to speak to Ruger. Instead, he used the identity of a captain to explain to Ruger. This allowed Ruger to accept everything he said without any resentment. Because war is not a one-on-one fight. With the right tactics we can still kill them like we did today without any bloodshed. Only by combining provocative words with facts could people be truly convinced. Regardless of whether Roddy had really been hiding his strength or not, the fact that he had single-handedly killed half of the wolf riders was right in front of them. They had no choice but to believe Roddy's words. Hearing these words, Lu Ji's originally wavering heart was filled with excitement that he had not felt for a long time. That was the blood in his bones that had not cooled yet. If you really have the confidence to command a team of scouts. And as long as we can kill those green-skinned beasts, I won't hold a grudge against anything that happened today. Lu Gu narrowed his eyes slightly. But if you're just exaggerating, there was no need to say anything else. This was just Lu Ji's way of expressing his stance. Roddy only nodded and accepted these words. He did not rush to say anything. Instead, he glanced at the scouts in front of him. After a few seconds, he continued, I just want to emphasize one point. This is war. All of us can die at any time. Not even our corpses will be left behind. The atmosphere instantly became quiet. If we want to stop them, what we need to do is not to scout, not to shoot a few arrows from afar and then run away. We need to fight the orcs face to face. We have to face those guys in the end. There is no chance. So, if anyone wants to quit, I won't stop them. But among those who stay, I don't want to see any cowards who will hold us back. At this moment, in front of this group of scouts, Roddy was indeed qualified to say such words to warn them. Regardless of whether this team of only 14 people could be called an army or not, any small team must have a backbone. And at this moment, Roddy was the core character of this team that was about to embark on an expedition. In the face of Roddy's words, no one backed down. Perhaps it was because of ignorance, or perhaps it was because of naivety, but more than that, it was because of the passion in their hearts that had not cooled down. This scene was actually not out of Roddy's expectations. He had fought on the battlefield for the kingdom of Karen before. He knew that regardless of whether the country was destroyed or not, its people would always have an unyielding will. Especially in this border region where wars were frequent, courage and courage were the most obvious labels for everyone. Things started to go smoothly after that. Roddy became the overall commander of the two scout teams. After deciding on the gathering time for tomorrow, he announced the dismissal of the team. After quietly eating dinner with everyone who had their own thoughts, he carried 2 machetes and walked to the blacksmith shop. Was there a need to fight this battle? Roddy pondered for a long time and finally made up his mind to fight. He was not a person who would rush in recklessly. As a former technical geek and ranger, what he knew the most was how to use the least amount of resources to do the most. Defeating Ruger in the morning was not just to vent his anger. Eliminating the unstable factors in the team was Roddy's main goal. It was good that Ruger knew his place. If he did not, Roddy would definitely not let him follow him. The results today were already better than expected. The scouts were united and had the same goal. With such a team, Roddy dared to make the decision to attack tomorrow. It was just 20 level 4 orcs. Roddy was confident that with his own methods and understanding of the orcs, he would be able to deal with them in a few days if he were to single-handedly deal with them. But that would mean the danger of the enemy replenishing their wolf riders. Considering his entire plan, Roddy still felt that a lone ranger could not change a country. He needed more resources, even if it was just a dozen scouts below level 4. But thinking about the number of orcs in the camp, he could not help but sigh. It is a little troublesome. Thinking about the scene today, the orc camp had already dug trenches to stop the cavalry's attack. This was undoubtedly one disaster after another for the scouts who had the advantage of horses. If the orcs defended the stronghold, it would be impossible to win with fewer troops on the plains. Although there was a chance of winning with conventional tactics, there would definitely be heavy casualties. Roddy walked into the smithy with 2 orc scimitars in his hands. He was thinking about how to deal with the most enemies in the shortest amount of time. However, he did not expect blacksmith Stan of Norland Village to be so frightened by his attitude that he almost ran away with a strange cry. The reason was that the orc scimitar was much more powerful than the scout's standard dagger. Ordinary people would find it extremely difficult to hold one. On the other hand, Roddy held one in each hand. He looked fierce and was even more terrifying than the bandits of the grasslands that the bards described. Blacksmith Stan had been forging iron for 30 years, but he did not see much of the world. The biggest city he had been to was Hollier City. Other than that, he had never seen a living orc, not to mention elves or halflings. So when Roddy walked into the shop in the sunset, he was really scared. "Uncle Stan, it's me." Roddy quickly put away his machetes and showed a harmless smile. Of course, Stan knew Roddy. In the morning, he was here to borrow some tools to polish the horn bow. But because the sky was completely dark, the silhouette was very hostile. Hearing Roddy's voice, the timid middle-aged man walked out from the corner. After a while, he came back to his senses and said after a few words of complaint, It's you, Roddy. What are you doing here so late at night?" "I want to borrow your furnace and anvil." Roddy went straight to the point and made a request that left Stan speechless. As an alternative PvP player, Roddy, who had the subclass of a berserker, had also studied weapon forging. It was just that his level was not at the top, but only at the advanced level. But compared to the blacksmith in front of him, Roddy was more than qualified to be the blacksmith's master. The weapons in Earthbreaker were not dropped by killing monsters. Most of the weapons used by players had to be made by themselves, including bows, arrows, conventional weapons, and even crossbows. Therefore, the number of life class players was not any less than those PvP players. And Roddy was one of the countless people who had worked tirelessly to make bows. For the current Roddy, he needed to make some modifications to the 2 machetes, including adjusting the center of gravity, reducing the weight of the blade, and improving the sharpness of the machetes. He had just reached level 2, so he could use both machetes at the same time. Roddy knew very well that his advantage lay in his memory and battle technique. The berserker's unparalleled ferocity lay in its ability to deal explosive damage in an instant. Although Sherfone was only a level 2 pawn right now, and his attributes were not just a little bit weaker than before, if he used the berserker's combat techniques to fight, his attack power would be doubled within a short period of time. The only thing he had to worry about was the loss of defense. Right now, he was just a level 2 basic profession. If it was defense, he could only rely on his own combat experience to dodge. But when facing the orcs, who were as strong as bulls, blocking and parrying was not very reliable. Without the suppression of his attributes, Roddy admitted that he could not compete with the green-skinned beasts in terms of strength. While Roddy was thinking about his battle tactics, Stan did not move at all. He only felt that Roddy had gone crazy. "Roddy, I know that your battle with the orcs is tough and dangerous, but that is not the reason for you to go crazy." Roddy's eyes flashed. Roddy came back to his senses and looked at Stan's comforting expression. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. I need to modify these two knives. I just need to borrow your tools. I don't need any extra materials. Do you think smithing is like playing with mud? I, Stan, have been smithing for 30 years. Before he could finish his sentence, he saw Roddy hand over the few copper coins he had on him. Count it as me playing with mud for once, okay, Uncle Stan? Roddy had no other choice but to use the same old trick. Fortunately, Stan was not that difficult to talk to. Seeing that Roddy insisted on using the knives, he could only wave his hand and let him use the tools. He did not even look at the 2 copper coins. Compared to Quartermaster Dick, he was a very kind and honest country bumpkin. Roddy did not waste any time. He took the tools and started working beside the furnace that had not extinguished yet. He skillfully pulled the bellows to increase the temperature of the flames. After that, he began to modify the knives with a ding, jingle sound. Stan, who originally thought that Roddy had suddenly thought of something, stood at the side with his arms crossed. At first, he only waited for Roddy to hit the hammer a few times before giving up. However, he did not expect that Roddy's actions were accurate and did not have any bad habit. He completely had the posture of a senior blacksmith. This made him widen his eyes. The arrogance that he had prepared to point out the country instantly disappeared. Chapter 14. Amateurs watch the excitement, while experts see the artistry. When ordinary people looked at blacksmiths, they felt that they were just raising hammers and randomly striking. However, only Stan, who had been forging iron for half his life, understood how profound the forging ability behind Roddy's hands was. Strength, accuracy, control of heat, and the steps of polishing were not things that could be learned immediately. Stan admitted that he could not be as perfect as Roddy. Fortunately, Roddy did not forge weapons but only modified them. Otherwise, not to mention a few hours, he would not be able to use them for a few weeks. However, it still took Roddy 3 to 4 hours to make the most basic modifications to the 2 scimitars. In the middle of the night, he finally completed the modifications. However, Stan still stood at the side and did not leave. Roddy, who had been working hard for half a day, felt sore all over his body. After all, his physique could not catch up to that of the ranger in the past. However, looking at the 2 scimitars in his hands, he was more confident in his next battle plan. After moving his stiff body, Roddy picked up the 2 scimitars and walked out of the blacksmith shop. Under the moonlight in front of the shop, he performed a set of the simplest basic movements of the dual-wielding scimitars. It included hacking, slashing, parrying, and various practical combat skills on the battlefield. Although it was only at level 2, the dignified aura of his movements was something that those scouts who only knew how to put on a show could never learn. He focused on adapting to the weight of the 2 scimitars. However, he did not know that Stan, who had been quietly watching from the side, had been completely frightened by his set of scimitar techniques. What was a soldier? To put it simply, it was a killing machine. This was the most essential thing. It was the ultimate goal that every soldier was trained for. However, among the scouts in Norland Village, except for Lou Bugia, the rest of the youths could not reach the standard of a soldier. This was Stan's conclusion. But now, looking at Roddy under the moonlight, he only felt that the young man in front of him was the most thorough killing machine. Looking at Roddy's figure, Stan seemed to have thought of something. In the end, he sighed inwardly and shook his head for some reason before turning around and leaving. Not long after, he walked over with a bag. Roddy had already sheathed his knife. He wiped his sweat and was ready to return the tools to Stan and thank him. However, he did not know that the blacksmith had given him the bag. Roddy lowered his head to take a look and discovered that there was a strange-looking gauntlet in the bag. Generally speaking, metal gauntlets would not be worn by soldiers other than heavy infantry. Knights wore full-body heavy armor, while ordinary infantry only had a simple layer of leather armor. Therefore, gauntlets were a scarce commodity for most soldiers. However, its use was not important for ordinary soldiers because the heavy gauntlets would slow down the movements of the soldiers when they swung their swords. Under such circumstances, experienced veterans would not wear them even if they had gauntlets. However, the reason why Stan took out this set of equipment was naturally not that simple. For Roddy, who wielded 2 scimitars, he could not use a shield to defend like ordinary soldiers. The only way to defend against attacks was to dodge and block with his scimitars. However, once he had this set of gauntlets, his defensive ability would definitely increase by leaps and bounds. I think I will never wear it again in my life. However, after seeing you, I feel that this set of gauntlets should not be eroded by time. Stan looked at the gauntlets and told his story with some emotion. His grandfather used to be a heavy infantry of the kingdom. When this type of army had just appeared, the kingdom only chose the strongest young men. However, after Stan's grandfather died on the battlefield, there was no one in the family who was qualified to be a heavy infantry. Among the equipment that was passed down, only this set of gauntlets was still usable. Stan's father did not inherit the glory of the kingdom, and Stan himself became a blacksmith who had been forging for his entire life. His son died of a serious illness 3 years ago. At this moment, when he saw the strength that Roddy had displayed, Stan, who felt a little sour in his heart, finally made this decision. Giving away this set of gauntlets could be considered as Stan burying his former hope. Roddy could understand the sorrow of a white-haired person sending off a black-haired person, but he could not truly understand it. After Stan finished speaking, Roddy seemed to be a little dazed. This was because a line of small words that others could not see flashed before his eyes. Stan's wish completed. If it was in the past, Roddy would probably not even have the thought of looking at Stan. He had always been the purest of players. Everything he did was based on his own interests, and he ignored everything else. However, now, he held the gauntlets with both hands and did not know what to say. Everything that was illusory in the past had become reality in front of him. In the past, Roddy, who wore a mask and interacted with NPCs in the game, suddenly felt a little dizzy. Looking at Stan's lonely face, Roddy even felt a little sad for some reason. In the end, he took the gauntlets and bowed to express his thanks. Like an ordinary young man, he bid farewell to this blacksmith who had also died in the flames of war in his memory. War was merciless. Roddy increasingly understood this point. In the past, he only knew about war through everything in the game, but now that it had become reality, he felt a heaviness that he had never experienced before. Carter, Ruger, and even that quartermaster Dick. These NPCs had now become lively characters in his life. They had their own stories and emotions, as well as their own worries and dreams. Roddy increasingly felt that he was slowly integrating into this dreamlike world. After putting away the gauntlets, he prepared to pack some items that could be used later. The only thing Roddy could do now was to try his best to complete the set goals in his mind. As a former life profession player, even if he lacked ingredients, he could still make some food that could increase his attribute. Fortunately, after Ruger agreed to the battle the next day, the entire scout team, including Dick in the quartermaster's office, understood that Roddy was currently the temporary leader. So, he effortlessly asked for ingredients from Dick, who was still asleep, and used his own methods to make some hemostatic bandages. These were the most basic skills in first aid, but sometimes they could really save a life. After preparing everything, Roddy fell into a deep sleep and waited for the arrival of the next day's dawn. Norland Village was a little cold in the morning. Everything looked the same as usual. Farmers carried hoes and walked on the dirt road, occasionally complaining about how difficult it was to pay the feudal lord's taxes. Women returned from milking, carrying wooden buckets, their heads covered with scarves, gossiping about the village. The only thing that was a little different was perhaps the members of the scout team. The joking sounds of the soldiers in the past had disappeared. In the small, bustling square, they silently packed up their belongings. To them, the enemy that they were going to face today was so strong that it made their legs go weak. Except for veterans like Ruger, the young scouts could not hide their nervousness at all. Their faces were pale, their legs were a little weak, and when they put on their armor, they tied the knots too tightly. All these signs told the yawning Roddy that the fighting strength of this army was really lacking. But who would be a natural elite soldier? Roddy knew this very well, so to him, today's mission was more like training. Sodden has already gone to Hollier City. After a quick breakfast, Carter had already found out the whereabouts of his superior. Obviously, this news meant that their actions would not be noticed by that greedy guy for at least 5 days. When the soldiers heard this, they had a strange feeling in their hearts. Hope that Sodden is here? That way they might not have to face those orcs. Hope that he is not here? That way they might become the hero that saves the border village. Before going to war, these rookies had a lot of feelings in their hearts, but the veterans' hearts were only numb. Ruger silently wiped his sword, emptying his mind like when he participated in a battle when he was young, leaving only the most focused state. But Roddy was not in a hurry to lead the entire scout team out. He counted the number of people. There were a total of 15 people in the two teams, including himself. Facing the orcs who had about 25 people was really impossible, so after he gathered all the scouts, he gave a very simple and surprising order. Rest, stay where you are and wait for further orders. We will attack at night, that way our chances of winning will be higher. Before dark, I will be responsible for telling you how to face these green-skinned bastards. When Roddy spoke, he was no longer as timid as he used to be. Instead, he was full of energy and confidence. A leader must have his own charisma. This sentence was indeed reflected in Roddy, who had been reborn. His confidence came from countless battles against the orc. Ruger and Carter looked at each other. They did not understand what Roddy was going to do. If he only taught them combat skills now, wouldn't it be a complete last-minute training? But Roddy did not care about their surprised gazes. After telling Dick to prepare some items, he pulled more than 10 soldiers to the drill ground and began this temporary training. In Roddy's eyes, a group of humans who had never fought against the orcs face to face could not imagine how strong they were. What he needed to do was to teach them the enemy's weaknesses. This included the orcs' fighting style, fighting skills, footsteps, and movement habits. These were all the experiences of countless people on the battlefield. If they could remember 3 or 4 of these, their chances of survival were often several times higher than those who did not know. So in Roddy's eyes, this kind of temporary training was completely necessary. The orcs are very strong. Never think of using weapons to block them. Don't even try to use a shield. When you realize that your arm is broken, it will be too late to dodge. How do we judge their attacks? Keep your eyes on their shoulders. If you see any movement, immediately retreat. The orcs' turning movements are very slow. Don't try to face them alone. When 3 people surround an orc, you must learn to circle around it. After a few simple explanations, Roddy even demonstrated how to fight against the orc. It sounded a little ridiculous, but only a real technical geek would understand how important these things were. It must be understood that Roddy's research on the orcs was enough for him to write a professional thesis. Different orcs' attack intervals, attack styles, attack routes, footsteps, and even their language. Roddy had done in-depth research on them. Roddy had relied on this research to become one of the top PvP players in just a few short years, from a half-baked life player to the forefront of PvP players. The experience in his head could allow a group of young people who only practiced with wooden swords on the drill ground to understand how to deal with the seemingly strong but abnormally stupid green-skinned barbarians in a short period of time. Chapter 15. As the sun was about to set, the quartermaster, Dick, placed the items that Roddy needed into more than 10 parcels and passed them to him while panting. This time, he did not look like he was trying to bribe Roddy. Instead, there was an indescribable sense of respect in his eyes. "Everything is here." Roddy took the parcels and nodded. He then turned around and ordered the soldiers behind him, who had changed into black uniforms and were equipped with blackened swords. "Check the equipment." The time for battle had finally arrived. However, there was not much confusion and nervousness on the faces of the scouts. After a day of training and explanation, they had reached the peak of their mental state. Roddy had already instilled the simple formula of "the orcs are not invincible" into their minds. Their greatest fear of the unknown had disappeared. Now, they were facing a group of enemies that knew almost all of their weaknesses. So, at this moment, the morale of the troops was unprecedentedly high. Everyone even had a strong confidence in the upcoming battle. Each of them was equipped with a short bow and 6 arrows. They carried the parcels that Roddy had specially requested. Their swords were in place, and their armor was fastened tightly. The 14 scouts who were ready to go got on their horses and rode off into the distance as the sun set. Before they left Norland Village, everyone had a full meal. When they left, the villagers seemed to have noticed that the soldiers were different from usual. They looked at the dust in the distance and remained silent. "Is this really going to work?" Carter did not really believe that the attack this time would be as confident as Roddy had said. Although they had won both battles against the orcs, he had a rough idea of their strength. If the young men around him were to encounter the orcs, they would probably be slaughtered. Although Roddy had pointed out many of the orcs' weaknesses, it was still just a theory. "Why not?" Roddy asked as he looked at the gradually disappearing sun from the back of his horse. He held the reins with one hand and caressed the hilt of his curved sword with the other. "Now is not the time to think about whether or not we can defeat the orc. We have to believe that we can win this battle." The last ray of light in the sky disappeared. The 30-kilometer journey was soon over. As night fell, the war horses gradually slowed down. Finally, under Roddy's orders, all the soldiers began to abandon their war horses and move forward on foot. The wind in the prairie still carried a faint fresh smell. His body crouched low as he crossed a low grassy slope. He could only hear the whistling sound of the wind. Sticking his head out to look 300 meters away, he could see the flickering light of a bonfire in the orc camp. All the scouts crouched on the other side of the grassy slope, looking at the orc camp from afar. Their expressions became serious. Most of them looked at Roddy, not knowing how the temporary commander was going to attack. As the leader, Roddy licked his index finger and raised it to determine the direction of the wind. Then, he led the group slowly to the downwind. During this time, all the soldiers took out their short bows and nocked arrows, ready to deal with any unexpected situation. At this moment, everyone was nervous. No matter how much Roddy had said about the weaknesses of the orcs, when they really saw the 2-meter-tall orcs with arms thicker than their legs, only a few could remain completely calm. Roddy did not expect them to fight bravely, but his only request was that they did not make any unnecessary movements. As they slowly approached the orc camp, the young scouts could even hear the loud voices of the orcs talking. Roddy walked at the front, Ruger was in the middle, and Carter was at the back. Because of the morning training, the group had a sense of strict obedience. Although the camp was simple, there was a wooden sentry tower. At this moment, there was a sentinel who was dozing off on top. It was just that the sky was dark, and the sentinel did not notice more than a dozen human scouts who were at a disadvantage 100 meters away. Or rather, the sentinel did not even consider the possibility of being attacked by humans. Among everyone, only Roddy knew that the orc's eyesight was much worse than humans at night. This was the conclusion Roddy had drawn from countless successful night attacks on orcs. The camp in front of them was surrounded by trenches dug to defend against the charge of warhorses. Because the Orc Empire was poor in resources, the only wood they had was used to build sentry towers. Therefore, the orcs who only had the strength to use this simplest method of defense. However, this created a big problem. When someone was hiding in these trenches in the dark, even the sentinel standing on the sentry tower would not be able to detect them. To Roddy, the key to this battle was not whether the scouts behind him could fight bravely, but whether his plan could be carried out smoothly. After making sure that the sentinel was looking at the other side, Roddy led the scouts and quietly jumped into the trenches. After making sure that everyone was in position, he left an order to wait for orders. After that, he silently advanced on the ground like a ghost. The essence of the Ranger class was that it was powerful when it was alone. It was similar to the stealth ability of an assassin, and it was powerful long-range sniping ability. Therefore, in Earth Splitter, the Ranger could often play a more active role than the assassin on the battlefield with complicated terrains. At this moment, how much strength could Roddy, who was only level 2, use? For a guy who had played countless games without getting hurt, this was the first time he took the initiative to attack since he came to this world. His figure quietly glided through the shadows. When he arrived at the edge of the tent that was only 15 meters away from the sentry tower, Roddy could already see the figure of the orc on the top clearly. At this moment, it was as if the orc had become one with the grass. His gauntlets and weapons had long been blackened by the fire and no longer reflected light. He was lying on the ground motionlessly like a stone. So now is the time. The sentinel on the sentry tower yawned. Roddy immediately took advantage of the short few seconds to dash to the bottom of the sentry tower. This distance made it difficult for the sentinel to notice him, but from another point of view, the orcs in the camp could easily notice this uninvited guest. However, everything was still quiet. A few orcs in the camp did not notice him at all. Roddy's figure was completely hidden in the shadows of the tent and the sentry tower. As the only source of light came from the campfire in the center of the camp, he could easily inspect the entire structure of the camp without being discovered by anyone. Tents, stables, and simple sentry tower. These were the only 3 types of buildings in the camp. After re-evaluating the number of orcs, Roddy estimated that there might be around 25 orcs in the camp. He spent around 5 minutes memorizing the entire layout of the building, the ratio of patrolling soldiers, and the routes. After completing all the preparations, he immediately returned to the trench not far away without making any noise. Know yourself and know your enemy, and you will emerge victorious in every battle. This saying had been repeated for many years, but Roddy clearly understood the importance of it. At this time, after taking the risk to investigate, he had already made a suitable plan in his mind for the next battle. When Roddy reappeared beside the scouts, his silent but abnormally fast movements startled the young men. Ruger was shocked. He naturally understood what Roddy's ability meant, and this made him feel more at ease. At least the more capable Roddy was, the higher the chance of success in this battle. Take out the packages. Roddy made a silent hand gesture. Ruger was the first to react. Carter and the rest of the soldiers then followed and rummaged through the packages. They immediately discovered that there were some arrowheads stained with fuel. Almost everyone was given a set of flint and tinder to ignite the fire. Team 2, follow me. Team 1, stand by. Roddy said in a low voice. He missed the time when he could only communicate with his comrades through tactical hand gestures. Obviously, these people in front of him did not have that kind of tactical literacy. He called the captain of Team 1, Ruger, and added, "Have everyone in Team 1 prepare 3 fire arrows. Once you hear screams in the camp, Immediately ignite them and shoot at the tents that are connected together on the west side. After that, follow the trench and walk 60 meters to the west. When you see me at the sentry tower, directly rush into the camp. Understood? Ruger immediately understood Roddy's tactical intention and nodded solemnly to indicate that he accepted the order. Carter, bring the people of Team 2 and follow me. Roddy looked up at the dim moonlight above his head. He gripped his horn bow tightly and walked along the trench to the east side. When the 7 scouts of Team 2 followed Roddy to the east side of the camp, everything was still silent. But the rapid heartbeats of the soldiers made their foreheads sweat slightly. Their palms holding the short bows were a little slippery, and the surge of adrenaline caused their fingertips to tremble slightly. These were unavoidable phenomena, and Roddy did not say much about it. Even he himself was the same when he ambushed the orcs for the first time. After calling all the scouts of Team 2 in front of him, Roddy quietly arranged the next task. There are 3 orcs on the regular patrol in the camp, and 4 in total, including the sentry tower. We need to kill them in one shot, then immediately climb up to the sentry tower to attract their firepower and shoot as many as possible. Ruger will support us later. When they rush into the camp, just listen to my orders. He glanced at the young men and Carter beside him, then pointed at the small round shields that were previously used as backup equipment. After climbing up the sentry tower, one person will cover the other and shoot arrows. Don't let yourself become the opponent's target. That's all I want to say, understood? Chapter 16. The entire orc camp was not big. There were only 3 orcs patrolling the area. Their footsteps were sloppy, and they were not worried about being attacked. They just patrolled the area every half an hour or so. At this time, the light from the bonfire gradually dimmed, making the field of vision even darker. However, the orcs' sturdy bodies were still obvious in the light. When the 3 orcs' figures slowly walked around the tent and appeared in the eyes of the second team of scouts, Roddy, as the commander, began to give the soldiers beside him the order to attack in a low voice. Shoot the one on the left. Shoot the one in the middle. You, the one on the right. Shoot the one on the left. 6 soldiers were arranged to take aim at the 3 orcs, while Roddy himself took 2 steps back. He took a light breath and said in a low voice, "Shoot when you hear the sound of my bowstring, and then immediately run towards the sentry tower." Immediately after, the horn bow was suddenly pulled into a full moon shape, and the long arrow was aimed at the sentinel on the sentry tower. The horn bow, which had been installed with a sound suppressor, only produced a barely noticeable muffled sound in the darkness. This was the result of Roddy adjusting the bow block. Compared to the explosive sound of the orc's bow, the horn bow now could be said to be almost silent. The arrow streaked across the pitch-black night. Puff. His arrow instantly pierced through the orc sentry's head. The sound of the arrowhead piercing through the skull was covered by the sound of the bonfire. The sentry did not even have time to scream before he died. The sound of his body falling did not even reach the other end of the trench. At the same time, 6 arrows were shot at the 3 patrolling orcs 17 meters away. Although the scout's short bow was not as powerful as the horn bow in Roddy's hand, shooting at such a close distance still severely injured the orcs. 2 orcs fell to the ground in an instant, but one of them did not die because the arrow missed. The sudden attack caused him to roar in fear. He hesitated for 2 seconds, then raised the weapon in his hand, wanting to rush over. But in the next moment, his throat was pierced by Roddy's arrow. Putting down the bow in his hand, Roddy no longer suppressed his voice and shouted, "Follow me!" In the next moment, Roddy took the lead and dashed towards the sentry tower in the distance. The 6 scouts behind him ran after him in unison. When Roddy reached the sentry tower, he stabbed the bodies of 2 other orcs whose fate was unknown. He then led the scouts over the orcs' corpses and dashed towards the 10-meter-tall sentry tower in the distance. The bonfire elongated the shadows of these scouts, who had experienced a sneak attack for the first time. The orc camp had entered a state of alert after that brief shout just now. The young scouts felt as if their hearts were about to jump out of their chests, because they could even see many swaying figures appearing on the tents. Quick! Charge! Roddy patted Carter's back and gestured for all the scouts to climb the wooden ladder of the sentry tower. He, on the other hand, moved from his position as the leader to the rear. More and more figures rushed out of the orc tents in a hurry. Roddy, who was holding the horn bow, did not hesitate to raise his hand and draw the bow. An arrow shot an orc more than 10 meters away in the eye socket. While reaching for the next arrow, he turned around and stepped onto the wooden sentry tower. After taking 3 steps, he turned around and shot another arrow. Pooh! An orc who ran to the weapon rack to retrieve his horn bow was shot through the back of his heart and fell to the ground. Logically speaking, if the same arrow hit a non-vital part, even with the horn bow in Roddy's hand, it would still take 3 to 4 arrows to kill an orc of the current level. However, Roddy's accurate archery was like a cheat. Every arrow was able to cause critical damage and instantly kill the opponent. At the current stage, unless he encountered a powerful enemy that he could not break through, Roddy's attack power had an overwhelming advantage. However, this did not mean that he was invincible. More and more enemies poured out of the camp. Although Carter and the others who had climbed to the top of the sentry tower began to fire suppressive shots, it was obvious that the 7 of them could not stop the orcs' advance. After Roddy reached the top of the sentry tower, he killed 2 orcs who were trying to get close to the sentry tower with 3 arrows in a row. However, he was anxiously waiting for Luja's actions. Finally, just as the group of orcs were about to rush up the sentry tower, a flaming red arrow suddenly flew across the sky from the other side of the camp. The flaming arrows flew towards the flammable tent. 3 consecutive batches of fire arrows covered almost all the tents on the east side of the camp. In less than half a minute, the fire started to get out of control. The orcs who ran out of the tents were instantly dumbfounded. An orc who looked like the leader shouted an order, but before he could finish, he was accurately shot by Roddy. This attack was the most crucial one in the entire battle. After losing their leader, chaos began to spread in the orcs' camp. Therefore, in the next 5 minutes, the scouts on the sentry tower began to fire suppressive shots without any pressure. The hesitation of these orcs caused them to not know whether to put out the fire or charge up the sentry tower under the rain of arrows. This was because the 6 corpses in front of the sentry tower with arrows in their heads clearly told them that there was an extremely powerful character on the tower. This situation proved that Roddy's plan was working. After the 3 batches of fire arrows passed, Roddy directly turned back and shouted at Carter, "Everyone, get down the tower and charge." His order was immediately answered. In the distance, the first team, who had circled around the place where the arrows were fired, shouted loudly and rushed towards the camp from another direction. They had already carried out his previous order perfectly. At this moment, all the orcs were dumbfounded. For a moment, they thought that they were surrounded by humans. In the dark, they could not see how many people there were outside their camp. The only thing they knew was that there were people around them who were constantly being shot and falling to the ground. As the soldiers on the sentry tower rushed down, these orcs actually reacted in disorder before they even faced the humans head-on. They had underestimated the number of humans and lost their leader in the first place. This continuous attack caused the orcs to not even have the consciousness to resist. They directly collapsed and scattered like birds and beasts. At this moment, they were far from their usual fierce combat strength. The veteran Ruger had already pierced the throat of an orc with his sword. The orc did not have the will to fight due to panic and fear. He did not even have the time to resist before he was killed by Ruger. Ruger could not suppress the joy in his heart. He was so excited that he wanted to shout out loud. He had never thought that a war could be fought like this. From the beginning to the end, he had the upper hand and won with fewer people. In the dark, he had defeated the enemy as soon as they came into contact. There was no longer any contempt for Roddy. At this moment, he was completely convinced by Roddy. He twisted his body to dodge and slashed horizontally with his sword. Another orc's head flew up into the sky. Blood splattered everywhere. Ruger shouted to boost the morale of the team. Then, he turned his head and saw Roddy's figure in the distance. At the same time, Roddy raised the scimitar in his hand. At that moment, Lu Gu finally understood what kind of person he had offended. If the previous battle made him understand how terrifying the orcs were, then Roddy's current situation made him understand that humans could also deal with the orcs in this way. Facing the human scouts who rushed down from the sentry tower, the orcs only showed the most basic resistance. The orc standing at the front waved the wooden stick in his hand and swept it horizontally. However, the human in front of him suddenly fell to the ground and forcibly avoided the whistling sound of the wooden stick. The next moment, when the orc raised his arm and wanted to attack, the human in front of him jumped up like a carp and stood up. He combined his two swords and slashed at the orc's collarbone. Caw! The sound of metal colliding with bone was heard. However, Roddy's strength was not enough to completely cut off the orc's arms. So, he changed his move and raised his leg to kick the orc's chest. He used the force of the kick to backflip and landed on the ground. He pulled out his two swords and spun in a big circle with blood splattering everywhere. Then, he used the momentum of inertia to swing his swords at the orc again. The orc whose arms were injured tried to block with the scimitar in his hand. However, he found that Roddy's first slash had broken his block. The second slash followed closely and slashed diagonally into the orc's neck. The orc's arteries were broken. Half of the orc's head was cut off. Blood spurted out more than a meter high from his neck. This was the power of dual-wielding weapons. Pure attack after attack. The rhythm was much fiercer and fiercer than a two-handed weapon or a sword and shield combination. Even the orcs, who were power-type enemies, could not adapt and block in a short period of time. On the other hand, Roddy's strength aroused the desire of his comrades to fight. They rushed towards the panicking enemies. Together with Lu Gu and the others, they began to encircle the last 10 orcs in the camp. Although the 14 scouts were more than the remaining 12 orcs, Roddy did not dare to be careless. Even if he was the strongest in the team, he knew that he could not face more than 2 orcs at the same time. At this moment, victory was not in the bag. So, Roddy immediately shouted to Ruger and Carter, "Get out of the way and force them to retreat." The method of surrounding 3 orcs and 1 orc was not outdated. Under the sea of fire, the orcs did not have much fighting spirit. Ruger, who had already killed the 3rd orc, immediately retreated to the side and opened up the biggest path out of the camp. Just as Roddy expected, the orcs really retreated under the encirclement. After he used his swords to chop off the head of an injured orc, they turned around and began to flee. They won just like that? The human soldiers in the camp panted as they watched the orcs flee into the distance. They could not believe what they were seeing. However, when they reacted and wanted to chase after the orcs, they heard Roddy's loud order to stop them. Clear the battlefield immediately and retreat. Roddy raised his hand and killed the orc, who still had a trace of life left by his feet. He shouted to Ruger, "We must leave here in 5 minutes. Return to the warhorses. No one is allowed to stay." Understood. Ruger loudly responded to his order. Then, he quickly called a few soldiers to clean up the battlefield. The results of the statistics shocked even a veteran like him. In the entire battle, there were no casualties among the scouts. Only 3 were lightly injured. He was very clear that almost all the credit went to Roddy. If it wasn't for the fire attack and the suppression of the sentry tower, if it wasn't for his accurate archery, if it wasn't for his arrangements, the orcs would not have been defeated so easily. and Roddy understood that the current result was the limit of what he could do. To be honest, the 8 orcs that escaped had no chance of winning unless they gave him a chance to kill them one by one. He naturally understood the principle of not chasing a cornered enemy, but the most important thing now was to settle the spoils of war. Fortunately, these scouts were not mercenary players. At this time, the ground was littered with orc corpses and the soldiers were searching for the spoils of war. But Roddy knew that these guys would not carry the truly useful things with them. A half-burnt tent at the side had completely collapsed. Roddy hurriedly ran over and pulled away the still-burning cloth. Then, he rummaged through the ashes to find what he wanted. The orcs had a habit. The highest leaders liked to put their valuables under their bed, even if their bed was a simple wooden board or a pile of soft straw on the ground. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.